They Asked for a Paper, Papers and Addresses, by C.S. Lewis, published 1962 by Geoffrey Blease, at London. Acknowledgements. While much of the material acknowledged below is my own copyright, I would like to thank all those who have allowed me to reprint the papers in this book. Descriptione Temporum was my inaugural lecture from the Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Cambridge, and published by the Syndics of the Cambridge University Press in 1954. The literary impact of the authorized version was the Ethel M. Wood lecture delivered before the University of London and published by the Athlone Press of the University of London in 1950. Hamlet, the Prince or the Poem was the 1942 annual Shakespeare lecture of the British Academy and was published for the British Academy by Humphrey Milford of the Oxford University Press. Kipling's World was a paper addressed to the English Association. Sir Walter Scott was a toast proposed to the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club in 1956. Lilies That Fester was written for 20th Century in 1955. Psychoanalysis and Literary Criticism was first read to a literary society at Westfield College, and then published by the English Association in Essays and Studies, Volume 27, 1941. The Inner Ring was a memorial oration delivered at King's College, University of London in 1944 and published by Geoffrey Bless. Is Theology Poetry and On Obstinacy and Belief were both papers read to the Oxford Socratic Club and published by them in 1944 and 1955 in the Socratic Digest. Transposition, now slightly augmented, was a sermon preached in Mansfield College, Oxford, and published by Geoffrey Bless, and The Weight of Glory, which was a sermon given in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Oxford, was first published by SPCK and then by Geoffrey Bless. I must thank Mrs. George Bainbridge, Messrs. Methuen and Macmillan for the use of quotations from Kipling's works. Since these papers were composed at various times during the last 20 years, passages in them, which some readers may find reminiscent of my later work, are in fact anticipatory or embryonic. I have allowed myself to be persuaded that such overlaps were not a fatal objection to their republication. CSL, Cambridge, 1962. 1. Descriptione Temporum, inaugural lecture at Cambridge, 1954. Speaking from a newly founded chair, I find myself freed from one embarrassment only to fall into another. I have no great predecessors to overshadow me. On the other hand, I must try, as the theatrical people say, to create the part. The responsibility is heavy. If I miscarry, the university might come to regret not only my election, an error which at worst can be left to the great healer, but even, which matters very, very much more, the foundation of the chair itself. That is why I've thought it best to take the bull by the horns and devote this lecture to explaining as clearly as I can the way in which I approach my work, my interpretation of the commission you have given me. What most attracted me in that commission was the combination medieval and Renaissance. I thought that by this formula the university was giving official sanction to a change which has been coming over historical opinion within my own lifetime. It is temperately summed up by Professor Cesnak in the words, quote, "As the Middle Ages and the Renaissance come to be better known, the traditional antithesis between them grows less marked," end quote, from J. Cesnak, 1940. Some scholars might go further than Professor Cesnak, but very few, I believe, would now oppose him. If we are sometimes unconscious of the change, that is not because we have not shared it, but because it has been gradual and imperceptible. We recognize it most clearly if we are suddenly brought face to face with the old view in its full vigor. A good experiment is to reread the first chapter of J. M. Burden's Early Tudor Poetry, New York, 1920. It is still in many ways a useful book, but it is now difficult to read that chapter without a smile. We begin with 29 pages, and they contain several misstatements, of unrelieved gloom about grossness, superstition, and cruelty to children. And on the 29th comes the sentence, "The first rift in this darkness is the Copernican doctrine," as if a new hypothesis in astronomy would naturally make a man stop hitting his daughter about the head. No scholar could now write quite like that. But the old picture, done in far cruder colors, has survived among the weaker brethren, if not, let us hope, at Cambridge, yet certainly in that western darkness from which you have so lately bidden me emerge. Only last summer, a young gentleman whom I had the honor of examining described Thomas Wyatt as the first man who scrambled ashore out of that great dark surging sea of the Middle Ages. End quote. Footnote, a delicious passage in Comparetti, Virgil in the Middle Ages, contrasts the Middle Ages with more normal periods of history. That's from 1895. This was interesting because it showed how a stereotype image can obliterate a man's own experience. Nearly all the medieval texts which the syllabus had required him to study had in reality led him into formal gardens where every passage was subdued to a ceremonial and every problem of conduct was dovetailed into a complex and rigid moral theology. From the formula medieval and Renaissance, then, I inferred that the university was encouraging my own belief that the barrier between those two ages has been greatly exaggerated, if indeed it was not largely a figment of humanist propaganda. At the very least, I was ready to welcome any increased flexibility in our conception of history. All lines of demarcation between what we call periods should be subject to constant revision. Would that we could dispense with them altogether. As a great Cambridge historian, G.M. Trevelyan, 1944, has said, quote, unlike dates, periods are not facts. They are retrospective conceptions that we form about past events, useful to focus discussion, but very often leading historical thought astray. End quote. The actual temporal process, as we meet it in our own lives, and we meet it in a strict sense nowhere else, has no divisions, except perhaps those blessed barriers between day and day, our sleeps. Change is never complete, and change never ceases. Nothing is ever quite finished with. It may always begin over again. This is one of the sides of life that Richardson hits off with wearying accuracy. And nothing is quite new. It was always somehow anticipated or prepared for. A seamless, formless continuity in mutability is the mode of our life. But unhappily, we cannot, as historians, dispense with periods. We cannot use for literary history the technique of Mrs. Wolfe's The Waves. We cannot hold together huge masses of particulars without putting into them some kind of structure. Still less can we arrange a term's work or draw up a lecture list. Thus we are driven back upon periods. All divisions will falsify our material to some extent. The best we can hope for is to choose those which will falsify at least. But because we must divide, to reduce the emphasis to any one traditional division must in the long run mean an increase of emphasis in some other division. And that is a subject I want to discuss. If we do not put the great divide between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where should we put it? I ask this question with the full consciousness that, in the reality studied, there is no great divide. There is nothing in history that quite corresponds to a coastline or a watershed in geography. If, in spite of this, I still think my question worth asking, that is certainly not because I claim for my answer more than a methodological value, or even much of that. Least of all would I wish it to be any less subject than others to continual attack and speedy revision. But I believe that the discussion is as good a way as any other of explaining how I look at the work you have given me. When I have finished it, I shall at least have laid the cards on the table, and you will know the worst. The meaning of my title will now have become plain. It is a chapter heading borrowed from Isidore, 1911. In that chapter, Isidore is engaged in dividing history as he knew it into its periods, or as he calls them, the eotates. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing these Latin words correctly. I shall be doing the same. Assuming that we do not put our great frontier between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, I shall consider the rival claims of certain other divisions which have been or might be made. But first, a word of warning. I am not, even on the most Lilliputian scale, emulating Professor Toynbee or Spengler. About anything that could be called the philosophy of history, I am a desperate skeptic. I know nothing of the future, nor even whether there will be any future. I don't know whether past history has been necessary or contingent. I don't know whether the human tragicomedy is now in Act 1 or Act 5, whether our present disorders are those of infancy or old age. I am merely considering how we should arrange or schematize those facts, ludicrously few in comparison with the totality, which survive to us, often by accident, from the past. I am less like a botanist in a forest than a woman arranging a few cut flowers for the drawing room. So, in some degree, are the greatest historians. We can't get into the real forest of the past. That is part of what the word past means. The first division that naturally occurs to us is that between antiquity and the Dark Ages, that is to say, the fall of the empire, the barbarian invasions, the christening of Europe. And of course, no possible revolution in historical thought will ever make this anything less than a massive and multiple change. Do not imagine that I mean to belittle it. Yet I must observe that three things have happened since, say, Gibbon's time, which make it a shade less catastrophic for us than it was for him. 1. The partial loss of ancient learning and its recovery at the Renaissance were for him both unique events. History furnished no rivals to such a death and such a rebirth. But we have lived to see the second death of ancient learning. In our time, something which was once the possession of all educated men has shrunk to being the technical accomplishment of a few specialists. If we say that this is not total death, it may be replied that there was no total death in the Dark Ages either. It could even be argued that Latin, surviving as the language of Dark Age culture and preserving the disciplines of law and rhetoric, gave to some parts of classical heritage a far more living and integral status in the life of those ages than the academic studies of the specialists can claim in our own. As for the aereo and the tempo of the two deaths, if one were looking for a man who could not read Virgil, though his father could, he might be found more easily in the 20th century than in the 5th. 2. To Gibbon, the literary change from Virgil to Beowulf, or the Hildebrand, if he had read them, would have seemed greater than it can to us. We can now see quite clearly that these barbarian poems were not really a novelty, comparable to, say, The Waste Land or Mr. Jones' Anathemata. They were rather an unconscious return to the spirit of the earliest classical poetry. The audience of Homer and the audience of the Hildebrand, once they had learned one another's language and meter, would have found one another's poetry perfectly intelligible. Nothing new had come into the world. 3. The christening of Europe seemed to all our ancestors, whether they welcomed it themselves as Christians or like Gibbon deplored it as humanistic unbelievers, a unique, irreversible event. But we have seen the opposite process. Of course, the unchristening of Europe in our time is not quite complete, neither was her christening in the Dark Ages. But roughly speaking, we may say that whereas all history was for our ancestors divided into two periods, the pre-Christian and the Christian, and two only, for us it falls into three, the pre-Christian, the Christian, and what may be reasonably called the post-Christian. This surely must make a momentous difference. I am not here considering either the christening or the unchristening from a theological point of view. I am considering them simply as cultural changes. Footnote. It is not certain that either process, seen, if we could see it, sub specie aeternatus, would be more important than it appears to the historian of culture. The amount of Christian, that is, of penitent and regenerate, life in any age, as distinct from Christian civilization, is not to be judged by mortals. When I do that, it appears to me that the second change is even more radical than the first. Christians and pagans had much more in common with each other than either has with a post-Christian. The gap between those who worship different gods is not so wide as between those who worship and those who do not. The pagan and Christian ages alike are what Pausanias would call the dreumenon. That's Greek, which I don't know what it means. The externalized and enacted idea, the sacrifice, the games, the triumph, the ritual drama, the mass, the tournament, the mask, the pageant, the epithamalium, and with them symbolic and ritual and symbolic costumes, trebeia and laudiclave, crown of wild olive, royal crown, coronet, judge's robes, knight's spurs, herald's tabard, coat armor, priestly vestment, religious habit, for every rank, trade, or occasion its visible sign. But even if we look away from that into the temper of men's minds, I seem to see the same. Surely the gap between Professor Ryle and Thomas Browne is far wider than that between Gregory the Great and Virgil. Surely Seneca and Dr. Johnson are closer together than Burton is with Freud. You see already the lines along which my thought is working, and indeed it is no part of my aim to save a surprise for the end of the lecture. If I have ventured a little to modify our view of the transition from the antique to the dark, it is only because I believed we have since witnessed a change even more profound. The next frontier which has been drawn, though not till recently, is that between the Dark and the Middle Ages. We draw it somewhere about the early 12th century. This frontier clearly cannot compete with its predecessor in the religious field, nor can it boast such drastic redistribution of populations. But it nearly makes up for those deficiencies in other ways. The change from ancient to dark had, after all, consisted mainly in losses. Not entirely. The Dark Ages were not so unfruitful in progress as we sometimes think. They saw the triumph of the codex, or hinged book over the roll or volumen, a technical improvement almost as important for the history of learning as the invention of printing. All exact scholarship depends upon it. And if, here I speak under correction, they also invented the stirrup, they did something almost as important for the art of war as the inventor of tanks. But in the main, they were a period of retrogression. Worse houses, worse drains, fewer baths, worse roads, less security. We notice, for instance, in Beowulf, that an old sword is expected to be better than a new one. With the Middle Ages, we reach a period of widespread and brilliant improvement. The text of Aristotle is recovered. Its rapid assimilation by Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas opens up a new world of thought. In architecture, new solutions of technical problems lead the way to new aesthetic effects. In literature, the old alliterative and assonantal meters give place to that rhymed and syllabic verse which was to carry the main burden of European poetry for centuries. At the same time, the poets explore a whole new range of sentiment. I am so far from underrating this particular revolution that I have before now been accused of exaggerating it. But great and small are terms of comparison. I would think this change in literature the greatest, if I did not know of a greater. It does not seem to me that the work of the troubadours and Christian and the rest was really as great a novelty as the poetry of the 12th century. A man bred on the Chanson de Roland might have been puzzled by the Lancelot. He would have wondered why the author spent so much time on the sentiments and so comparatively little on the actions. But he would have known that this was what the author had done. He would, in one important sense, have known what the poem was about. If he had misunderstood the intention, he would at least have understood the words. That is why I do not think that the change from dark to middle can, on the literary side, be judged equal to the change which has been taking place in my own lifetime. And of course in religion it does not even begin to compete. A third possible frontier remains to be considered. We might draw our line somewhere towards the end of the 17th century with the general acceptance of Copernicanism, the dominance of Descartes, and in England, the foundation of the Royal Society. Indeed, if we were considering the history of thought in the narrower sense of the word, I believe that this is where I would draw my line. But if we are considering the history of our culture in general, it is a different matter. Certainly, the sciences then began to advance with a firmer and more rapid tread. To that advance, nearly all the later and, in my mind, vaster changes can be traced. But the effects were delayed. The sciences long remained like a lion cub whose gambols delighted its master in private. It had not yet tasted man's blood. All through the 18th century, the tone of the common mind remained ethical, rhetorical, juristic, rather than scientific, so that Johnson, in his Life of Milton, could truly say, quote, "The knowledge of external nature and the sciences which that knowledge requires or includes are not the great or the frequent business of the human mind." End quote. It is easy to see why. Science was not the business of man, because man had not yet become the business of science. It dealt chiefly with the inanimate, and it threw off few technological byproducts. When Watt makes his engine, when Darwin starts monkeying with the ancestry of man, and Freud with his soul, and the economist with all that is his, then indeed the lion will have got out of its cage. Its liberated presence in our midst will become one of the most important factors in everyone's daily life. but not yet, not in the 17th century. It is by these steps that I have come to regard as the greatest of all divisions in the history of the West, that which divides the present from, say, the age of Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott. The dating of such things must, of course, be rather hazy and indefinite. No one could point to a year or a decade in which the change indisputably began, and it has probably not yet reached its peak. Well, that's certainly true. But somewhere between us and the Waverley novels, somewhere between us and Persuasion, the chasm runs. Of course, I had no sooner reached this result than I asked myself whether it might not be an illusion of perspective. The distance between the telegraph post I am touching and the next telegraph post looks much longer than the sum of the distances between all the other posts. Could this be an illusion of the same sort? We cannot pace the periods as we could pace the posts. I can only set out the grounds on which, after frequent reconsideration, I have found myself forced to reaffirm my conclusion. 1. I begin with what I regard as the weakest, the change between Scott's age and ours in a political order. On this count, my proposed frontier would have serious rivals. The change is perhaps less than that between the Antiquity and the Dark Ages, yet it is very great. I think it extends to all nations, those we call democracies as well as dictatorships. If I wished to satirize the present political order, I should borrow for it the name which Punch invented during the First German War, governtisement. This is a portmanteau word and means government by advertisement. But my intention is not satiric. I am trying to be objective. The change is this. In all previous ages that I can think of, the principal aim of rulers, except at rare and short intervals, was to keep their subjects quiet, to forestall or extinguish widespread excitement and persuade people to attend quietly to their several occupations. And on the whole, their subjects agreed with them. They even prayed, in words that sound curiously old-fashioned, to be able to live a peaceable life in all godliness and honesty, and pass their time in rest and quietness. But now the organization of mass excitement seems to be almost the normal organ of political power. We live in an age of appeals, drives, and campaigns. Our rulers have become like schoolmasters and are always demanding keenness. And you notice that I am guilty of a slight archaism by calling them rulers. Leaders is the modern word. I have suggested elsewhere that this is a deeply significant change of vocabulary. Our demand upon them has changed no less than theirs upon us. For of a ruler, one asks justice, incorruption, diligence, and perhaps clemency. Of a leader, dash, initiative, and I suppose what people call magnetism or personality or panache. On the political side, then, this proposed frontier has respectable but hardly conclusive qualifications. 2. In the arts, I think it towers above every possible rival. I do not think that any previous age produced work which was, in its own time, as shatteringly and bewilderingly new as that of the Cubists, the Dadaists, the Surrealists, and Picasso has been in ours. And I am quite sure that this is true of the art that I love best, that is, of poetry. This question has often been debated with some heat, but the heat was, I think, occasioned by the suspicion, not always ill-grounded, that those who asserted the unprecedented novelty of modern poetry intended thereby to discredit it. But nothing is further from my purpose than to make any judgment of value, whether favorable or the reverse. And if once we can eliminate that critical issue and concentrate on the historical fact, then I do not see how anyone can doubt that modern poetry is not only a greater novelty than any other new poetry, but is new in a new way, almost in a new dimension. To say that all new poetry was once as difficult as ours is false. To say that any was is an equivocation. Some earlier poetry was difficult, but not in the same way. Alexandrian poetry was difficult because it presupposed a learned reader. As you became learned, you found the answers to the puzzles. Skaldic poetry was unintelligible if you did not know the Kennegar, but intelligible if you did. And, this is the real point, all Alexandrian men of letters and all skalds would have agreed about the answers. I believe the same to be true of the dark conceits of Donne. There was one correct interpretation of each, and Donne could have told it to you. Of course, you might misunderstood what Wordsworth was up to in lyrical ballads, but everyone understood what he said. I do not see in any of these the slightest parallel to the state of affairs disclosed by a recent symposium on Mr. Eliot's Cooking Egg, Essays in Criticism, July 1953. Here we find 7 adults, 2 of them Cambridge men, whose lives have been specially devoted to the study of poetry, discussing a very short poem which has been before the world for 30-odd years, and there is not the slightest agreement among them as to what, in any sense of the word, it means. I am not in the least concerned to decide whether this state of affairs is a good thing or a bad thing. I merely assert that it is a new thing. Footnote: in music we have pieces which demand more talent in the performer than the composer. Why should there not come a period when the art of writing poetry stands lower than the art of reading it? Of course, rival readings would then cease to be right or wrong and become more or less brilliant performances. End footnote. In the whole history of the West, from Homer, I might almost say from the Epic of Gilgamesh, there has been no bend or break in the development of poetry comparable to this. On this score, my proposed division has no rival to fear. 3. Thirdly, there is the great religious change, which I have had to mention before, the unchristening. Of course, there were lots of skeptics in Jane Austen's time and long before, as there are lots of Christians now. But the presumption has changed. In her day, some kind and degree of religious belief and practice were the norm. Now, though I would gladly believe that both kind and degree have improved, they are the exception. I have already argued that this change surpasses that which Europe underwent at its conversion. It is hard to have patience with those Jeremiahs in press or pulpit who warn us that we are relapsing into paganism. It might be rather fun if we were. It would be pleasant to see some future prime minister trying to kill a large and lively milk-white bull in Westminster Hall. But we shan't. What lurks behind such idle prophecies, if they are anything but careless language, is the false idea that the historical process allows mere reversal, that Europe can come out of Christianity by the same door as in she went, and find herself back where she was. It is not what happens. A post-Christian man is not a pagan. You might as well think that a married woman recovers her virginity by divorce. The post-Christian is cut off from the Christian past and therefore doubly from the pagan past. 4. Lastly, I play my trump card. Between Jane Austen and us, but not between her and Shakespeare, Chaucer, Alfred, Virgil, Homer, or the Pharaohs, comes the birth of the machines. This lifts us at once into a region of change far above all that we have hitherto considered. For this is parallel to the great changes by which we divide epochs of prehistory. This is on the level with the change from stone to bronze, or from a pastoral to an agricultural economy. It alters man's place in nature. The theme has been celebrated till we are all sick of it, so I will say here nothing about its economic or social consequences, immeasurable though they are. What concerns us more is its psychological effect. How has it come about that we use the highly emotive word stagnation, with all its malodorous and malarial overtones, for what other ages would have called permanence? Why does the word primitive at once suggest to us clumsiness, inefficiency, barbarity? When our ancestors talked of the primitive church or the primitive purity of our Constitution, they meant nothing of that sort. The only pejorative sense which Johnson gives to primitive in his dictionary is significantly formal, affectedly solemn, imitating the supposed gravity of old times. Why does latest in the advertisements mean best? Well, let us admit that these semantic developments owe something to the 19th century belief in spontaneous progress, which itself owes something either to Darwin's theorem of biological evolution or to that myth of universal evolutionism, which is really so different from it and earlier. For the two great imaginative expressions of the myth, as distinct from the theorem, Keats' Hyperion and Wagner's Ring, are pre-Darwinian. Let us give these their due. But I submit that what has imposed this climate of opinion so firmly on the human mind is a new archetypal image. It is the image of old machines being superseded by new and better ones. For in the world of machines, the new most often really is better, and the primitive really is the clumsy. And this image, potent in all our minds, reigns almost without rival in the minds of the uneducated. For to them, after the marriage and births of their children, the very milestones of life are technical advances. From the old push-bike to the motorbike and thence to the little car, from gramophone to radio, from radio to television, from the rage to the stove, these are the very stages of their pilgrimage. But whether from this cause or from some other, assuredly that approach to life which has left these footprints on our language is the thing that separates us most sharply from our ancestors, and whose absence would strike us as most alien if we could return to their world. Conversely, our assumption that everything is provisional and soon to be superseded, that the attainment of goods which we never yet had, rather than the defense and conservation of those we have already, is the cardinal business of life, would most shock and bewilder them if they could visit ours. I thus claim from my chosen division of periods that on the first count it comes well up to scratch, on the second and third it arguably surpasses all, and on the fourth it quite clearly surpasses them without any dispute. I conclude that it is really the greatest change in the history of Western man. At any rate, this conviction determines my whole approach to my work from this chair. I am not preparing an excuse in advance, lest I should hereafter catch myself lecturing either on the Epic of Gilgamesh or on the Waverley novels. No, the field, medieval and Renaissance, is already far too wide for my powers. But you see how to me the appointed area must primarily appear as a specimen of something far larger, something which had already begun when the Iliad was composed and was still almost unimpaired when Waterloo was fought. Of course, within that immense period there are all sorts of differences. There are lots of convenient differences between the area that I am to deal with and other areas. There are important differences within the chosen area. And yet, despite all this, that whole thing, from its Greek or pre-Greek beginnings down to the day before yesterday, seen from the vast distance at which we stand today, reveals a homogeneity that is certainly important and perhaps more important than its interior diversities. That is why I shall be unable to talk to you about my particular region without constantly treating things which neither began with the Middle Ages nor ended with the end of the Renaissance. In that way, I shall be forced to present you with a great deal of what can only be described as Old European or Old Western culture. If one were giving a lecture on Warwickshire to an audience of Martians, no offense, Martians may be delightful creatures, one might loyally choose all one's data from that county. But much more of what you told them would not really be Warwickshire lore, but common Tellurian. The prospect of my becoming, in such halting fashion as I can, the spokesman of Old Western culture alarms me. It may alarm you. I will close with one reassurance and one claim. First, for the reassurance. I do not think you need fear that the study of a dead period, however prolonged and however sympathetic, need prove an indulgence in nostalgia or an enslavement to the past. In the individual life, as the psychologists have taught us, it is not the remembered but the forgotten past that enslaves us. I think the same is true of society. To study the past does indeed liberate us from the present, from the idols of our own marketplace. But I think it liberates us from the past, too. I think no class of men are less enslaved to the past than historians. The unhistorical are usually, without knowing it, enslaved to a fairly recent past. Dante read Virgil. Certain other medieval authors evolved the legend of Virgil as a great magician. It was the more recent past. The whole quality of mind evolved during the few preceding centuries, which impelled them to do so. Dante was freer. He also knew more of the past. And you will be no freer by coming to misinterpret Old Western culture as quickly and deeply as those medievals misinterpreted classical antiquity, or even as the Romantics misinterpreted the Middle Ages. Footnote. As my examples show, such misinterpretations may themselves produce results which have imaginative value. If there had been no romantic distortion of the Middle Ages, we should have no Eve of St. Agnes. There is room both for an appreciation of the imagined past and an awareness of its difference from the real past. But if we want only the former, why come to a university? The subject deserves much fuller treatment than I can give it here. End footnote. Such misinterpretation has already begun. To arrest its growth while arrest is still possible is surely the proper task for a university. And now for the claim, which sounds arrogant, but I hope is not really so. I have said that the vast change which separates you from the Old Western has been gradual and is not even now complete. Wide as the chasm is, those who are native to different sides of it can still meet, are meeting in this room. This is quite normal at times of great change. The correspondence of Henry Moore and Descartes is an amusing example. One would think that the two men were writing in different centuries. And there comes the rub. I myself belong far more to that old Western order than to yours. I am going to claim that this, in one way, is a disqualification for my task, is yet in another a qualification. The disqualification is obvious. You don't want to be lectured on Neanderthal men by a Neanderthaler, still less on dinosaurs by a dinosaur. And yet, is that the whole story? If a live dinosaur dragged its slow length into the laboratory, would we not all look back as we fled? What a chance to know at last how it really moved and looked and smelled and what noises it made. And if the Neanderthaler could talk, then, though his lecturing technique might leave much to be desired, should we not almost immediately learn from him some things about him which the best modern anthropologist could never have told us? He could tell us without knowing he was telling. One thing I know, I would give a great deal to hear any ancient Athenian, even a stupid one, talking about Greek tragedy. He would know in his bones so much that we seek in vain. At any moment, some chance phrase might, unknown to him, show us where modern scholarship had been on the wrong track for years. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you somewhat as that Athenian might stand. I read as a native texts that you must read as foreigners. You see why I said that the claim was not really arrogant. Who can be proud of speaking fluently his mother tongue, or knowing his way about his father's house? It is my settled conviction that in order to read Old Western literature aright, you must suspend most of the responses and unlearn most of the habits that you have acquired in reading modern literature. And because this is a judgment of a native, I claim that even if the defense of my conviction is weak, the fact of my conviction is a historical datum to which you should give full weight. That way, where I fail as a critic, I may yet be useful as a specimen. I would even dare to go further. Speaking not only for myself, but for all other old Western men whom you may meet, I would say, use your specimens while you can. There are not going to be many more dinosaurs. 2. The literary impact of the Authorised version. The Ethel M. Wood Lecture, the University of London, 1950. No translation can preserve the qualities of its original unchanged. On the other hand, except where lyrical poetry is in question, the literary effect of any good translation must be more indebted to the original than to anything else. This is especially true of narrative and of moral instruction. Where the originals are Hebrew, it holds in an unusual degree even for lyrical poetry, because the parallelism of the form is a translatable quality. There is therefore no possibility of considering the literary impact of the Authorized version apart from that of the Bible in general. Except in a few passages where the translation is bad, the Authorized version owes to the original its matter, its images, and its figures. Our aesthetic experience in reading any of the great Old Testament stories, or, say, the liberation of St. Peter and the shipwreck of St. Paul, depends only to a small extent on the translator. That is why I hope I may be excused for prefacing what I have to say about the literary fortunes of our English Bible by some remarks on the literary fortunes of the Bible before it became English. What is common, even from the literary point of view, to the originals and all the versions, is, after all, far more important than what is peculiar. And by carrying the story a little further back, we may have more chance to be cured of our dangerous, though natural, assumption that a book which has always been praised has always been read in the same way, or valued for the same reasons. Virgil's Homer was very different from Chapman's, Chapman's from Pope's, Pope's from Andrew Lang's, and Andrew Lang's from Mr. Rieu's. There is a certain sense in which the Bible as literature does not exist. It is a collection of books so widely different in period, and kind, and language, and aesthetic value that no common criticism can be passed upon them. In uniting these heterogeneous texts, the Church was not guided by literary principles, and the literary critic might regard their inclusion between the same boards as a theological and historical accident, irrelevant to his own branch of study. But when we turn from the originals to any version made by one man, or at least bearing the stamp of one age, a certain appearance of unity creeps in. The Septuagint, the Vulgate, Luther's Bible, or the Authorized version can each perhaps be regarded as a book. And in the minds of those who used these translations, the impression, if you will, the illusion of unity, was increased by the unity of the liturgical context in which they were heard, and also by the doctrine of inspiration. A belief in strictly verbal inspiration will indeed make all Scripture a book by a single author. Hence Donne, in his 79th sermon, rather comically passes favorable judgment on the style of the Omnipotent, assuring us that the Holy Ghost is an eloquent author, a vehement and abundant author, but not yet luxuriant. End quote. The Bible, thus considered for good or ill as a single book, has been read for almost every purpose more diligently than for literary pleasure. Yet certain testimonia to it, even on that score, can be collected from earlier ages. The oldest literary appreciation that I know is also the most modern in tone. When Longinus, or maybe it's Longinus, praises the author of Genesis, in his language, the lawgiver of the Jews, for the sublimity of conception, he seems to express a literary experience very like our own. Genesis is placed beside Homer and in some respects preferred to him. The Bible is being ranked among the classics on purely secular grounds. But it would be difficult to cite strict parallels from the ages that follow. The learned Monsieur de Bruyn, in his Études d'esthétique médiévale, 1946, has collected a mass of evidence about the literary appreciation of Scripture in the Middle Ages. Praise is not lacking, but we certainly find ourselves in an alien world. On the threshold of that period, we meet St. Augustine's curious statement that the Bible uses humillimum genus loquendi, the most humble kind of speech. If this referred to style in the narrower sense, if the Psalms and Prophets seemed to him to use the lowest language, it would be almost inexplicable. Almost, but not quite. The great roaring machine of Latin rhetoric can at times deafen the human ear to all other literature. But from the context, I suppose that St. Augustine is referring to something rather different, to that apparent naivety or simplicity of the literal sense which offended him until he had been taught that it was merely the outer shell, concealing the sacramentorum altitudo, the high mysteries. This distinction between the literal or historical sense and the allegorical senses, however these are classified by different doctors, is a fundamental factor in all medieval reading of the Bible. It is no doubt true, and must be insisted upon, that no superstructure of allegories was allowed to abrogate the truth of the literal sense. Hugo of St. Victor urges upon his pupils the necessity of mastering the literal sense first. I think, he writes, you will never be perfectly subtle in the allegory unless you are first grounded in the history. End quote. Yet this very passage reveals how inevitably the medieval exegesis belittled what we should regard as the actual literary quality of the text. It is clear that Hugo expects his pupils to hurry through the historical sense too quickly and perfunctorily. Noli contemnere minime haec, he adds, despise not these small things. If you had despised the alphabet, you would not now be able to read. An appreciation for which the story of Joseph and his brethren, or David and Goliath, was merely the alphabet, a necessary preliminary to higher and more delightful studies, may have been keen, but it was very unlike our own. Hence, we are not surprised to find him saying that the Scriptures are like a honeycomb. They appear dry on the outside per simplicitatem sermonis, but are dulcidine plena within. Notice how the simplicitas sermonis echoes St. Augustine's humillimum genus loquendi. Again, the Scripture may be compared to a harp. The spiritual senses are like the strings. The historical sense is like the wood, which does not itself sound, but keeps the strings together. That comparison also from Hugo. I do not wish in any way to deride the doctrine of multiple senses. Our own age, steeped in the symbolism of dreams and in the allegorical or semi-allegorical work of writers like Kafka or Mr. Rex Warner, will not look down on that doctrine with superiority. we may anticipate a revival of the allegorical sense in biblical criticism. But it will probably be dangerous, and in the Middle Ages I think it was dangerous, to appreciation of the historical books as plain heroic narrative. St. Thomas Aquinas throws a little more light on the references which we have already met to the lowness or simplicity of the Bible. He explains why Scripture expresses divine truths not merely through corporeal images, but even through images of vile bodies rather than noble. This is done, he says, to liberate the mind from error, to reduce the danger of any confusion between the symbol and the reality. It is an answer worthy of a profound theologian. At the same time, the passage in which it occurs reveals attitudes most hostile to aesthetic appreciation of the sacred text. It would seem, he says, that the Scripture ought not to use metaphors, for what is proper to the lowest kind of learning, infime doctrinae, does not seem suitable to the queen of the sciences. But metaphor is proper to poetry, and poetry is the lowest of all forms of learning, est infima inter omnes doctrinas. The answer, so far as it concerns us here, is that poetry and Scripture use metaphor for quite different reasons. Poetry for delight, and Scripture propter necessitatem et utilitatem. That is, on account of the need for and the utility of. Where the 19th century critic might have said that Scripture was itself the highest poetry, St. Thomas says that rather that the highest and the lowest doctrine have paradoxically one point in common, but of course for different reasons. From other medieval writers, notably Ulrich of Strasbourg, De Bruyn has collected passages which seem, but perhaps not without illusion, to come nearer to the modern point of view. In general, however, I do not think we shall go too far if we say that medieval appreciation of the Bible is divided from modern by a very wide gulf. If the medieval approach is alien, that of the Renaissance seems to me sometimes repellent. We reach the age of Ciceronianism, of humanism, of that deadly classical dignity which so obscured and distorted, among many other things, the classics themselves. It was an age in which Scaliger could tax Homer with vulgarity and complain that Andromache's lament over Hector smacked of an ill-bred woman. Where an aesthetic like this prevailed, the simple grandeur of kings and judges and the Gospels had little chance of being valued at its true worth. Hence Vida thought that the story of the Passion could be improved by the tinsel of Christiad. In a sense, of course, it is only a literary counterpart to the religious paintings of the time. There, too, vast Vitruvian halls rise as a background to deep abstracted holy scenes. I leave to others a problem I have failed to solve, why this offends in words so much more than it does in paint, and pursue our immediate subject by tracing the effect of this movement on even so great a man as Sir Thomas More. In his late treatise On the Passion, he ventures to put words into the mouths of our Lord. The thing had been done before. In the Imitation of Christ, it had been so done as to satisfy not only our piety, but our sense of the Dominical style. But More takes the words in Gethsemane, "This is your hour and the power of darkness," and seems to think that they can be strengthened by expansion into the following. "This is the short while that is granted ye, and the liberty given unto darkness, that now ye may in the night, which till this hour ye could never be suffered to bring to pass in the day, like monstrous ravening fowls, like screech owls and hags, like backs, howlets, night crawls, and birds of the helly lake, go about with your bills, your talents, your teeth, and your shrill screeching outrageously, but all in vain, thus in the dark to flee upon me." End quote. I ought to warn you that I am quoting a translation, that of More's granddaughter, but if anyone looks at the Latin and likes it much better than the English, I shall be surprised. I am not, of course, suggesting for one moment any spiritual flaw. The question is about More's taste. Indeed, the more we reverence him as a man, the more striking the example becomes. Even a man so steeped as he is in the spirit of the Dominical utterances could be, by humanistic rhetoric, so deafened to the majesty of their style. With the first Protestant translators, we get some signs of a changed approach. I would wish to take every precaution against exaggerating it. The history of the English Bible, from Tyndale to the Authorised version, should never for long be separated from that European and by no means exclusively Protestant movement of which it made part. No one can write that history without skipping to and fro across national and religious boundaries at every moment. Here, he will have to go from Sochino, the Sochino Hebrew Bible, 1488, to Reuchlin's Hebrew Grammar, 1506, then to Alcala for Cardinal Ximenes' Great Polyglot, 1514, and North for Erasmus' New Testament in the same year, and then to Luther for the German New Testament in 1522, pick up Hebrew again with Münster's Grammar in 1525, and see Luther worked over by Zwingli and others for the Zurich Bible of 1529, and glance at the two French versions of 34 and 35, and by no means neglect the new Latin translations of Paginus, 28, and Münster, 34-35. That is the sort of background against which Tyndale, Coverdale, Geneva, and Rheims must be set. For when we come to compare the versions, we shall find that only a very small percentage of variants are made for stylistic or even doctrinal reasons. When men depart from their predecessors, it is usually because they claim to be better Hebraists or better Grecians. The international advance of philology carries them on, and those who are divided by the bitterest theological hatreds gladly learn from one another. Tyndale accepts corrections from Thomas More. Rheims learns from Geneva. Phrases travel through Rheims on their way from Geneva to Authorised. Willy-nilly, all Christendom collaborates. The English Bible is the English branch of a European tree. Yet in spite of this, there is something new about Tyndale. For good or ill, a great simplification of approach. Scripture, he writes, speaketh thus after the most grossest manner. Be diligent, therefore, that thou not be deceived with curiousness. End quote. In the words grossest manner, we recognize the echo of Augustine's Humilum Genus and Hugo St. Victor's Simplicitas Sermonis. That rusticity or meanness, which we find it so hard to discern in the Bible, is still apparent to Tyndale. The novelty is the rejection of the allegorical senses. That rejection he shares with most of the reformers, and even as regards parts of the Bible with a humanist papist like Colette, or is it Calais? And it is no part of my business to decide whether it marked an advance or a retrogression in theology. What is interesting is not Tyndale's negation of the allegories, but his positive approach toward the literal sense. He loves it for its grossness. God is a spirit, he writes, and all his words are spiritual. His literal sense is spiritual. End quote. That is very characteristic of Tyndale's outlook. For him, just as God's literal sense is spiritual, so all life is religion. Cleaning shoes, washing dishes, our humblest natural functions are all good works. The life of religion, technically so called, wins no higher room in heaven than a whore of the stews, if she repent. This would certainly seem to be an attitude more favorable to the literary appreciation of much scripture than any that we have yet encountered. On the other hand, Mr. Gavin Bone, whose loss we still deplore at Oxford, has said roundly that Tyndale hated literature. This is based on his fierce condemnation of medieval romance, a trait which is humanistic as well as puritanical. But I do not think he did hate literature. Where he speaks of his own work as a translator, he sounds like a man with a sense of style. And when he says that Hebrew and Greek go well into English, whereas, quote, thou must seek a compass in the Latin, and yet shall have much work to translate it well favoredly, so that it hath the same grace and sweetness, end quote. More important still is the evidence of his own original works. I wish I had time to digress on those works. Tyndale's fame as an English writer has been most unjustly overshadowed, both by the greater fame of More and by his own reputation as a translator. He seems to me the best prose writer of his age. He is inferior to More in what may be called the elbow room of the mind, and of course in humor. In every other respect he surpasses him, in economy, in lucidity, and above all in rhythmical vitality. He reaches at time a piercing quality which is quite outside More's range. As a man feeleth God in himself, so is he to his neighbor. I am thou thyself, and thou art I myself, and can be no nearer of kin. Be glad and laugh from the low bottom of his heart, that he might see love and love again. Who taught the eagles to spy out their prey? Even so the children of God spy out their Father. Though it is not strictly relevant, may I be excused, since the fact seems to be insufficiently known, for saying that Tyndale's social ethics are almost identical with those of More, quite equally medieval and equally opposed to what some call the new economics. The points on which these two brave and holy men agreed may have been few, but they were perhaps sufficient, had they been accepted, to have altered the course of our history for the better. It is not, of course, to be supposed that aesthetic considerations were uppermost in Tyndale's mind when he translated Scripture, The matter was much too serious for that. Souls were at stake. The same holds true for all the translators. Coverdale was probably the one whose choice of a rendering came nearest to being determined by taste. His defects as well as his qualities led to this. Of all translators, he was the least scholarly. Among men like Erasmus, Tyndale, Munster, or the Jesuits at Rheims, he shows like a rowboat among battleships. This gave him a kind of freedom. Unable to judge between rival interpretations, he may often have been guided half-consciously to select and combine by taste. Fortunately, his taste was admirable. The history of the Authorized version has been told so often that I will not attempt to retell it, and its beauties praised so lavishly that I will not praise them. Instead, I will proceed at once to its influence as an English book. I shall attempt to define that influence, for I think there has been a misunderstanding about it, and even a little exaggeration. Let us begin by distinguishing the various senses in which one book can be said to influence the author of another book. 1. A book may be, in the familiar language of research, a source. Lydgate mentions the loves of Mars and Venus. The immediate source might be some book like Boccaccio's De Genealogie. The ultimate source is Homer. It would, I think, be quite good English to say that Lydgate was here influenced by Homer. But that is not the most useful way of employing the word in literary history, nor is it generally so employed. If anyone wishes to call a source an influence, let him do so, but let him recognize a source as a very special kind of influence. Most of us, I expect, would prefer to distinguish source from influence altogether. A source gives us things to write about. An influence prompts us to write in a certain way. Homer is a source to Lydgate, but Homer was an influence on Arnold when he wrote Sir Robin Rustum. Ferdowsi's Shah Nama was Arnold's source, but not an influence on that poem. Malory was both a source and an influence in Tennyson's Morte d'Arthur. Elsewhere in the Idylls, a source, but perhaps hardly an influence. If these terms be accepted, we can distinguish the Bible as a source for English literature from the Bible as a literary influence. That it is a source of immense importance is obvious. For several centuries, its persons, scenes, and doctrines were familiar to every Englishman. They are constantly used for illustration and allusion. But of course, when the Bible is a source, there is usually nothing to show whether the Authorized version is being used or not. The Bible is one source for Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel. We would say Ahithophel, but his spelling of Achitophel's name is not derived from the Authorized. We may indeed assume that most authors, and all unlearned authors, after the 16th century, derived their biblical knowledge from that version, but this does not seem to me a fact of any importance. The persons and stories would be the same in whatever text they were known. In my view, the huge mass of biblical material in our literature has no place in an account of the influence of the Authorized version considered as an English book. 2. It would, I suppose, be possible to say that we are influenced by a book whenever we quote it, but probably no literary historian would wish to use the word influence in that way. It would seem to me reasonable to say, for example, that my own habit of immoderate quotation shows the influence of Hazlitt, but not the influence of the authors that I quote, or that Burton's habit of immoderate quotation might be influenced by Montaigne, not by the authors that he quotes. Frequent quotation is itself a literary characteristic. If the authors whom we rifle were not themselves fond of quotation, then in the very act of quoting, we proclaim our freedom from their influence. It is almost the difference between borrowing a man's clothes for a particular occasion and imitating his style of dress. If English literature is full of biblical quotation, I would not describe this as the influence of the Authorized version, any more than I should call Virgilians all those who quote Virgil. I am not saying that to do otherwise would necessarily be an improper use of language. I only think that mine useful for the purpose I have in hand. 3. So far I have been speaking of what may be called flagrant quotation, quotation isolated and proclaimed by typographical devices. But besides this, there is, of course, the embedded quotation, sentences or phrases from the Authorized version artfully worked into an author's own language so that an ignorant reader might not recognize them. Our literature is full of this, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Trollope, Swinburne, and Kipling, it becomes a positive nuisance. One contemporary American professor is very seriously infected. To this process, the word influence might much more naturally be applied. Yet even this does not seem to me to be an influence in the deepest sense, and I should prefer not to call it an influence at all. I will try to explain why. Let us begin by laying side by side with it two other phenomena of the same sort. the ubiquitous embedded quotations from Homer in Plato's prose, or from Shakespeare in English prose. The scraps of Homer slip very artfully in and out of the orchestration of a Platonic period, but of course they are all marked out from their surroundings by their meter and their dialect. No one would maintain that Plato's own style grows out of or was learned from Homer's. And indeed, the Homeric bits would not be doing their work unless they were felt to be very different from the Attic prose that surrounds them. They are used either for solemnity or facetiously, and the facetious is only the solemn stood on its head. The very response they demand depends on our feeling them as aliens. There would be no point in them unless we did. Far from showing that Plato's style has assimilated Homer's, they show the irreducible difference between them. And are not the embedded Shakespearean quotations in English the same? Of course, not every hack who speaks of a man more sinned against than sinning, or a consummation devoutly to be wished, knows that he is quoting Shakespeare. He may think, significantly, that he is quoting the Bible. He may even think he is using a proverb. But he knows quite well, and he expects his readers to know, that he is borrowing from somewhere. He counts on recognition. He is decorating his style. He wants the phrase to stand out from his own composition as gold lace stands out from a coat. The whole pleasure, such as it is, depends on the fact that the embedded quotation is different. In other words, that his own style is not influenced by Shakespeare. I believe that our embedded quotations from the Authorized version are nearly always in exactly this position. They are nearly always either solemn or facetious, only because the surrounding prose is different. In other words, only insofar as our English is not influenced by the Authorized version do they achieve the effect the authors intended. 4. Here at last we reach what I would describe as influence in the full and strict sense, the influence of the Authorized version on vocabulary. I do not think we are being, in this sense, influenced by Shakespeare when we speak of a consummation devoutly to be wished, but I do think we're influenced by him, though the phonetic history is complicated, whenever we use weird as an adjective. We do so with no sense of quotation. The word has really been assimilated, has gone into the bloodstream of our language. In the same way we are being influenced by Van Helmont and perhaps by Paracelsus whenever we use the word gas. In the same way we are being influenced by the Authorized version and its predecessors whenever we use the words beautiful, long-suffering, peacemaker, or scapegoat. Tyndale is our ultimate creditor for all these. But even here I must plead for a distinction. Henry Bradley rightly mentioned damsel, raiment, travail, and quick, in a sense alive, as words saved by the Authorized version for archaic and poetical use. But only for such use. They are not in the bloodstream. As for loving kindness and tender mercies, they are so generally confined either to religious contexts or to mockery, which, for our special purpose, tells the same tale, that I almost classify them as very short embedded quotations. 5. Finally, we come to literary influence in the fullest sense, the sense it bears when we say that Paradise Lost is influenced by Homer and Virgil, or 19th century journalism by Macaulay, or modern English poetry by T.S. Eliot. You will remember that I have defined influence in this sense as that which prompts a man to write in a certain way. But even within this definition, further distinctions break out. The influence may show itself in architectonics. That is the most obvious, though by no means the only manner, in which Virgil influences Milton. The whole plan of his epic is Virgilian. Very few English writers have undergone an influence of that sort from any book of the Bible. Tupper's Proverbial Philosophy and the Book of Mormon are perhaps instances. Some would add Blake's prophetic books. Again, influence may show itself in the use of language, in the rhythm, the imagery, or, using that word in its narrowest sense, the style. The influence of the rhythms of the Authorized version seems to me very hard to detect. Its rhythms are, in fact, extremely varied, and some of them are unavoidable in the English language. I am not at all sure that a resemblance in rhythm, unless supported by another resemblance, is even recognizable. If I were to say, at the regatta, Madge avoided the river and the crowd, would this without warning remind you of, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth? Even if it did, is the common rhythm, separated from community of thought and temper, a matter of any importance? I believe that wherever an English writer seems to us to recall the scriptural rhythms, he is always recalling other associations as well. The influence of rhythm, isolated from imagery and style, is perhaps an abstraction. In imagery, I suppose the influence to be very great, though I must frankly confess that I have not been able to invent a method of checking it. If English writers in elevated contexts tend to speak of corn and wine rather than of beef and beer and butter, of chariots rather than chargers, of rain rather than sunshine as a characteristic blessing, of sheep more often than cows, and of the sword more often than either the pike or the gun, of bread rather than mutton or potatoes as their lofty synonym for food. If stone is more poetical than brick, trumpets than bugles, and purple and fine linen loftier than satin and velvet, I suspect this is due to the Bible, but I have no rigorous proof. Nor in this sphere would it be easy to distinguish the biblical influence from that generally Mediterranean and ancient influence which comes from the classics as well as the Bible. But I believe the biblical influence is here very great. But in our style, in the actual build of our sentences, I think the influence has probably been less than we suppose. The perfect example of an influence in this field is that exercised on our prose by Dryden and his contemporaries, Tillotson and the like. You remember that he went all through the essay on dramatic poesy and altered every sentence that ended with a preposition. This is, I say, a perfect example of influence. No one can pretend that this curious taboo was inherent in the genius of the language and would have developed even without the action of Dryden and his fellow Gallicists. On the contrary, it is so alien from the language that it has never penetrated into the conversation of even the worst prigs, and serves no purpose but to increase those little bunches of unemphatic monosyllables that English was already prone to. On the other hand, it has so established itself in our formal style that thousands obey it unconsciously. It is very precisely a thing that prompts us to write in a certain way. Even I, who detest it for a Frenchified schoolroom superstition, often feel it plucking at my elbow. I doubt whether the Authorized version has achieved any comparable dominance over our style. Indeed, what astonishes me here is the failure of some of its most familiar terms to get into our language at all. It came to pass, answered and said, lo. Have these ever been used by any English writer without full consciousness that he was quoting? If we look into those authors who are usually said to be influenced by the style of the Authorized version, we shall find that such influence is indeed present, but that it is hardly dominant. I will consider Ruskin and Bunyan. In Ruskin, embedded quotation and imagery from the Bible are made great use of, but Homer and Spenser are used not very much less, Dante not infrequently, and all these are used consciously. What Ruskin tells us in his Praeterita about the formation of his own style is relevant. Had it not been for a constant reading of the Bible, I might probably have taken Johnson for my model of English. To a useful extent, I have always done so in these first essays, partly because I could not help it, partly of set and well-set purpose. The turns and returns of reiterated rambler and iterated idler fastened themselves in my ears and mind, nor was it possible for me till long afterwards to quit myself of Johnsonian symmetry in sentences intended either with the swordsman's or the paviour's blow, to cleave an enemy's crest and drive down the oaken pile of a principle. End quote. In his mature style, in this very passage, I think we can recognize the Johnsonian element. I cannot recognize the biblical. Elsewhere, though I do not deny its presence, and especially in the images, it is one of many resources. And I think resources is the best word. It is, so to speak, one of the colors in his paint box, used at his own discretion. He has many others. And what makes the total effect for me so very unlike the Authorized version is the periodic structure of Ruskin's prose. Already in the passage quoted, which is familiar and epistolary compared with the high passages in Modern Painters or The Stones of Venice, you will have noticed the transition, nor was it possible. That is learned from classical Latin. And so, in the long run, is the Ruskinian period as a whole, a structure descending from Cicero through the prose of Hooker, Milton, and Taylor, and then enriched with romantic coloring for which Homer and the Bible are laid under contribution. That seems to me the formula for Ruskin's style. If you could take away what comes from the Bible, it would be impaired. It would hardly, I think, be crippled. It would certainly not be annihilated. This is real influence, but limited influence. The influence of Italian epic on Spenser would be a good contrast. If you took away from the Fairy Queen everything that is learned from Ariosto and Boiardo, what would be left would be either nothing or a radically different poem. This is quite consistent with the view that Spencer had added something of his own and even transmuted his originals. The alchemist may turn silver into gold, but he has to have the silver. Bunyan, at first sight, will strike most of us as far more biblical than Ruskin, but this impression is partly due to the fact that both are to us rather archaic and rather simple in syntax. To that extent, any unlearned author of Bunyan's time would be bound to remind us of the Bible, whether he had even read it. We must discount that accidental similarity and look deeper. I take an example at random. So Mistrust and Timorous ran down the hill, and Christian went on his way. But thinking again of what he had heard from the men, he felt in his bosom for his roll, that he might read therein and be comforted. But he felt and found it not. Then was Christian in great distress, and knew not what to do, for he wanted that which used to relieve him, and that which should have been his pass into the celestial city. Hence, therefore, he began to be much perplexed, and knew not what to do. At last he bethought that he had slept in the arbor. End quote. The question is not how much of this might occur in the Authorized version, but how much might be expected to occur in Bunyan if he had not read the Authorized version. Much of it, of course, is quite unlike the Bible. Phrases like, "Then was Christian in great distress," "He wanted that which used to relieve him," "Here therefore he began to be much perplexed." There remain, "He went on his way," "He felt and found it not," and the use of "so" to introduce a new step in a narrative. These are in the manner of the Authorized version, though this use of "so" is not very common there, and is far commoner in Mallory. But I do not feel at all certain that Bunyan is deriving them from his Bible, and if we look through his work, we shall find that his best and most characteristic sentences often have a very unscriptural ring. But the man, not at all discouraged, fell to cutting and hacking most fiercely. So I looked up in my dream and saw the clouds rack at an unusual rate, upon which I heard a great sound of a trumpet. Why, he objected against religion itself. He said it was a pitiful, low, and sneaking business for a man to mind religion. Some also have wished that the next way to their father's house were here, or that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over. But the way is the way, and there's an end. At last he came in, and I will say that for my lord he carried it wonderful lovingly to him. There were but a few good bits at the table, but some of it was laid upon his trencher. End quotes. Such passages seem to me the essential Bunyan. His prose comes to him not from the Authorized version, but from the fireside, the shop, and the lane. He is as native as Mallory or Defoe. The scriptural images themselves take on a new homeliness in these surroundings. Quote, "She said she was sent for to go to her husband, and then she up and told us how she had seen him in a dream, dwelling in a curious place among immortals, wearing a crown playing upon a harp." End quote. The crown and the harp come no doubt from the Apocalypse, but the rest of the sentence comes from Bedfordshire, and in their village setting they are somehow transformed. Just so his delectable mountains are Bedfordshire hills magnified, green to the top. Without the Bible, he would not have written The Pilgrim's Progress at all, for his mind would have been utterly different. But its style might have been much the same without the Authorized version. If I am right in thinking that the Authorized version, as a strictly literary influence, has mattered less than we have often supposed, it may be asked how I account for the fact. I think there are two explanations. In the first place, we must not assume that it always gave so much literary pleasure as it did in the 19th century. Thanks to Professor Sutherland, most of us now know about the egregious Edward Harwood, who in 1768 published his liberal translation of the New Testament, being an attempt to translate the sacred writings with the same freedom, spirit, and elegance with which other English translations of the Greek classics have lately been executed. That's the title. Harwood wrote to substitute the elegance of modern English for the bald and barbarous language of the old vulgar version. And no doubt Harwood was, by our standards, an ass. But can he have been the only one of his kind, or does he voice a widely spread feeling which only reverence concealed? Bald and barbarous, lacking in elegance, we have heard something not quite unlike this before, have we not? The most grossest manner, simplicitas sermonus, humilumum genus loquendi. It is not a charge that anyone would be likely to bring against the Authorized version or its originals today, Those who dislike Scripture are now more likely to call its style florid or inflated. Those who like it would praise it for sublimity. When and how did this change occur? The answer, I suggest, is that the modern approach, or what was till lately the modern approach, to the Bible is deeply influenced by the Romantic movement, by which I mean not the lake poets, but that taste for the primitive and the passionate which can be seen growing through nearly the whole of the 18th century. The men who were engaged in exhuming the ballads, the Elder Edda, the sagas, the Nibelungenlied, and the Kalevala, the forges of Otranto and Ossian, those who dreamed of the bards and the druids, must have heard the Bible with new ears. The primitive simplicity of a world in which kings could be shepherds, the abrupt and mysterious manner of the prophets, the violent passions of Bronze Age fighting men, the background of tents and flocks and desert and mountains, the village homeliness of our Lord's parables and metaphors, now first, I suspect, become a positive literary asset. The vile bodies, which St. Thomas had to explain, were no longer felt to be vile. Something of the same sort was happening to Homer. Scaliger had found him low, Chapman had reverenced him for his hidden wisdom. With Pope's preface, we reach a different attitude. I would not be as delicate, he says, as those modern critics who are shocked at the servile offices and mean employments in which we now sometimes see the heroes of Homer engaged. There is a pleasure in taking a view of that simplicity, in opposition to the luxury of succeeding ages, in beholding monarchs without their guards, princes tending their flocks, and princesses drawing water from the springs. He significantly adds that he has admitted into his version several of those general phrases and manners of expression which have attained a veneration even in our language from being used in the Old Testament. End quote. I suggest then that until the Romantic taste existed, the Authorized version was not such an attractive model as we might suppose. That would be one cause limiting its influence. The second cause, I believe, was its familiarity. This may sound paradoxical, but it is seriously meant. For 3 centuries, the Bible was so well known that hardly any word or phrase, except those which it shared with all English books whatsoever, could be borrowed without recognition. If you echoed the Bible, everyone knew that you were echoing the Bible. And certain associations were caught up in every reader's mind, sacred associations. All your readers had heard it read as a ritual or almost ritual act at home, at school, and in church. This did not mean that reverence prevented all biblical echoes. It did mean that they would only be used either with conscious reverence or conscious irreverence, either religiously or facetiously. There could be a pious and a profane use, but there could be no ordinary use. Nearly all that was biblical was recognizably biblical, and all that was recognized was sacer, numinous. Whether on that account to be respected or on that account to be flouted made very little difference. Mark what Boswell says under Saturday, April 3rd, 1773. He, that is Dr. Johnson, disapproved of introducing scripture phrases into secular discourses. This seemed to me a question of some difficulty. A scripture expression may be used like a highly classical phrase to produce an instantaneous strong impression. End quote. Like a highly classical phrase, that is the point, and producing a strong impression. It is difficult to conceive conditions less favorable to that unobtrusive process of infiltration by which a profound literary influence usually operates. An influence which cannot evade our consciousness will not go very deep. It may be asked whether now, when only a minority of Englishmen regard the Bible as a sacred book, we may anticipate an increase of its literary influence. I think we might if it continued to be widely read, but this is not very likely. Our age has indeed coined the expression, the Bible as literature. It is very generally implied that those who have rejected its theological pretensions, nevertheless, continue to enjoy it as a treasure house of English prose. It may be so. There may be people who, not having been forced upon familiarity with it by believing parents, have been yet drawn to it by its literary charms and remained as constant readers. But I never happened to meet them. Perhaps it is because I live in the provinces. But I cannot help suspecting, if I may make an Irish bull, that those who read the Bible as literature do not read the Bible. It would be strange if they did. If I am right in thinking that the Bible, apart from its sacred character, appeals mostly to a romantic taste, we must expect to find it neglected and even disliked in our own age. The counter-romantic movement is indeed so violent that those of us who do not share it almost wonder if there is not something pathological in the violence. The hatred of romanticism has reached that stage at which it can see no differences of kind between the things hated. I read the other day an essay in which the author dismissed Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse on the ground that Morris manages these things better than Chesterton ever did, and nobody wants to preserve William Morris. End quote. I can understand, even if I deplore, the taste that does not want to preserve William Morris. What staggers me is the implication that Chesterton and Morris wrote the same sort of poetry. It is as if a man said, Holbein does all these things better than Titian. I can only conclude that the author's revulsion from romantic poetry had reached a degree of violence at which the difference between the cool watercolor effects of Morris, his northern bareness, his monotonous plashing melody, cannot be distinguished from all the gold and scarlet and all the orgiastic drumbeats of Chesterton. Phobias make strange bedfellows. Perhaps to those who cannot endure the presence of a cat, the huge square-headed tabby Tom and the little smoked-faced goblin from Siam are all one. But clearly, in an age so anti-romantic as this, all those qualities which once helped the Bible as literature will work against it. David weeping over Absalom, Moses at the burning bush, Elijah on Carmel, the horror of great darkness, the maniac among the tombs. What have these passages to say to an unbeliever, unless he is a romantic, or to a counter-romantic, unless he is a believer? What I am saying involves the view that an approach to the Bible which seemed to many of us in our youth to be simply human was in reality the product of a particular period in the history of taste. I hope you will find this the more credible because of our brief glances at the Bible's earlier history. The medieval taste for which the literal sense was merely the dry crust of a honeycomb, concealing the golden sweetness of the allegory, and the humanistic taste which felt that the simplicity of Scripture would be improved by rhetoric, may each have seemed in its own day natural and eternal. Against that background we can see in proper perspective the 18th and 19th century taste. No doubt we may conclude that the counter-romantic taste of the 20th century will also prove ephemeral. Indeed, whatever the hidden fuel may be, it can hardly blaze in its present fury for very long. It can be succeeded by other attitudes which we cannot predict. Inevitably, we ask whether any of these is likely to be favorable to a literary appreciation of the Bible. Stripped, for most readers, of its divine authority, stripped of its allegorical senses, denied a romantic welcome for his historical sense, will it nonetheless return on the wave of some new fashion to literary preeminence and be read? And of course we do not know. I offer my guess. I think it very unlikely that the Bible will return as a book unless it returns as a sacred book. Longinus could enjoy it without being a Christian. But then Longinus came as near to being a romantic as a Greek could, and his view of the world and man was in its own way a religious one. It would be rash to expect many more of his kind. Unless the religious claims of the Bible are again acknowledged, its literary claims will, I think, be given only mouth honor, and that decreasingly. For it is, through and through, a sacred book. Most of its component parts were written, and all of them were brought together for a purely religious purpose. It contains good literature and bad literature. But even the good literature is so written that we can seldom disregard its sacred character. It is easy enough to read Homer while suspending our disbelief in the Greek pantheon. But then the Iliad was not composed chiefly, if at all, to enforce obedience to Zeus and Athene and Poseidon. The Greek tragedians are more religious than Homer, but even there we have only religious speculation, or at least the poet's personal religious ideas, not dogma. That is why we can join in. Neither Aeschylus nor even Virgil tacitly prefaces his poetry with the formula, "Thus say the gods." But in most parts of the Bible, everything is implicitly or explicitly introduced with, "Thus saith the Lord." It is, if you like to put it that way, not merely a sacred book, but a book so remorselessly and continuously sacred that it does not invite, it excludes or repels the merely aesthetic approach. You can read it as literature only by a tour de force. You are cutting the wood against the grain, using the tool for a purpose it was not intended to serve. It demands incessantly to be taken on its own terms. It will not continue to give literary delight very long, except to those who go to it for something quite different. I predict that it will in the future be read as it has always been read, almost exclusively, by Christians. If many critics, especially older critics, speak of it differently today, I suggest that they may be influenced by amiable but unliterary motives. A sacred book rejected is like a king dethroned. Towards either of them there arises, in well-disposed minds, a chivalrous compunction. One would like to concede everything except the thing really at issue. Having supported the deposition, one would wish to make clear that one had no personal malice. Just because you cannot countenance a restoration, you are anxious to speak kindly of the old gentleman in his personal capacity, to praise his fund of anecdote or his collection of butterflies. But I cannot help thinking that when a critic is old enough to remember the Bible and its power prophesies for it a great future as literature, he is often unconsciously swayed by similar motives. But such courtesies will not preserve it. Neither the Bible nor those who still read it as believers invite them, and the generation which is now growing up will disregard them. For the Bible, whether in the Authorized or in any other version, I foresee only two possibilities: either to return as a sacred book, or to follow the classics, if not quite into oblivion, yet into the ghost life of the museum and the specialist's study. Except, of course, among the believing minority, who read it to be instructed and get literary enjoyment as a byproduct. 3. Hamlet, the Prince or the Poem? The annual Shakespeare lecture of the British Academy, 1942. A critic who makes no claim to be a true Shakespearean scholar, and who has been honored by an invitation to speak about Shakespeare to such an audience as this, feels rather like a child brought in at dessert to recite his piece before the grown-ups. I have a temptation to furbish up all my meager Shakespearean scholarship and to plunge into some textual or chronological problem in the hope of seeming for this 1 hour more of an expert than I am. But it really wouldn't do. I should not deceive you, and I should not even deceive myself. I have therefore decided to bestow all my childishness upon you. And first, a reassurance. I am not going to advance a new interpretation of the character of Hamlet. Where great critics have failed, I could not hope to succeed. It is rather my ambition, a more moderate one I trust, to understand their failure. The problem I want to consider today arises in fact not directly out of the prince's character, nor even directly out of the play, but out of the state of criticism about the play. To give anything like a full history of this criticism would be beyond my powers and beyond the scope of a lecture, but for my present purpose I think we can very roughly divide it into 3 main schools, or tendencies. The first is that which maintains simply that the actions of Hamlet have not been given adequate motives, and that the play is so far bad. Hanmer is perhaps the earliest exponent of this view. According to him, Hamlet is made to procrastinate because, quote, had he gone naturally to work, there would have been an end to our play, end quote. But then, as Hanmer also points out, Shakespeare ought to have contrived some good reason for the procrastination. Johnson, while praising the tragedy for its variety, substantially agrees with Hanmer. Quote, of the feigned madness of Hamlet there appears no adequate cause, end quote. Rumelin thinks that the wisdom which Shakespeare has chosen to hide under the wilder utterances of insanity is a foreign and disturbing element, as a result of which the piece presents the greatest discrepancies. In our own time, Mr. Eliot has taken the same view. Hamlet is rather like a film on which 2 photographs have been taken, an unhappy superposition of Shakespeare's work, quote, upon much cruder material, end quote. The play, in his words, is most certainly an artistic failure, end quote. If this school of critics is right, we shall be wasting our time in attempting to understand why Hamlet delayed. The second school, on the other hand, thinks that he did not delay at all, but went to work as quickly as the circumstances permitted. This was Ritson view. The word of a ghost, at second hand, quote, would scarcely in the eye of the people have justified his killing their king, end quote. That is why he, quote, counterfeits madness and puts the usurper's guilt to the test of a play, end quote. Klein, after a very fierce attack on critics who want to make the Prince of Denmark, quote, a German half-professor, all tongue and no hands, end quote, comes to the same conclusion. So does Werther, and so does MacDonald, and the position has been brilliantly defended in modern times.
In the third school or group, I include all those critics who admit that Hamlet procrastinates and who explain the procrastination by his psychology. Within this general agreement, there are no doubt very great diversities. Some critics, such as Hallam, Sievers, Raleigh, and Clutton-Brock, trace the weakness to the shock inflicted upon Hamlet by the events which precede and immediately follow the opening of the play. Others regard it as a more permanent condition. Some extend it to actual insanity. Others reduce it to an almost amiable flaw in a noble nature. This third group, which boasts the names of Richardson, Goethe, Coleridge, Schlegel, and Hazlitt, can still, I take it, claim to represent the central and, as it were, orthodox line of Hamlet criticism. Such is the state of affairs, and we are all so accustomed to it that we are inclined to ignore its oddity. In order to remove the veil of familiarity, I'm going to ask you to make an imaginative effort of looking at this mass of criticism as if you had no independent knowledge of the thing criticized. Let us suppose that a picture which you have not seen is being talked about. The first thing you will gather from the vast majority of the speakers, and the majority which includes the best art critics, is that this picture is undoubtedly a very great work. The next thing you discover is that hardly any two people in the room agree as to what it is a picture of. Most of them find something curious about the pose, and perhaps even the anatomy, of the central figure. One explains it by saying that it is a picture of the raising of Lazarus, and that the painter has cleverly managed to represent the uncertain gait of a body just recovering from the stiffness of death. Another, taking the central figure to be Bacchus, returning from the conquest of India, says that it reels because it is drunk. A third, to whom it is self-evident that he has seen a picture of the death of Nelson, asks with some temper whether you can expect a man to look quite normal just after he's been mortally wounded. A fourth maintains that such crudely representational canons of criticism will never penetrate so profound a work, and that the peculiarities of the central figure really reflect the content of the painter's subconscious. Hardly have you had time to digest these opinions when you run into another group of critics who denounce as a pseudo-problem what the first group has been discussing. According to the second group, there's nothing at all odd about the central figure, a more natural and self-explanatory pose they never saw, and they cannot imagine what all the bother's about. At long last you discover, isolated in a corner of the room, somewhat frowned upon by the rest of the company, and including a few reputable connoisseurs in its ranks, a little knot of men who are whispering that the picture is a villainous daub, and that the mystery of the central figure merely represents the fact that it is out of drawing. Now, if all this had really happened to any one of us, I believe that our first reaction would be to accept at least provisionally the third view, the death of Nelson view. Certainly, I think we should consider it much more seriously than we usually consider those critics who solve the whole Hamlet problem by calling Hamlet a bad play. At the very least, we should at once perceive that they have a very strong case against the critics who admire. Here is a picture, they might say, on whose meaning no two of you are in agreement. Communication between the artist and the spectator has almost completely broken down, for each of you admits that it has broken down as regards every spectator except himself. There are only two possible explanations. Either the artist is a very bad artist, or you are very bad critics. In deference to your number and your reputation, we choose the first alternative, though, as you will observe, it would work out to the same result if we chose the second. As to the next group, those who deny that there was anything odd about the central figure, I believe that in the circumstances I have imagined, we should hardly attend to them. A natural and self-explanatory pose in the central figure would be rejected as wholly inconsistent with its observed effect on all other critics, both those who thought the picture good and those who thought it bad. If we now return to the real situation, the same reactions appear quite reasonable. There is indeed this difference that the critics who admit no delay and no indecision in Hamlet have an opponent with whom the corresponding critics of the picture were not embarrassed. The picture did not answer back. But Hamlet does. He pronounces himself a procrastinator, an undecided man, even a coward, and the ghost in part agrees with him. This, coupled with the more general difficulties of their position, appears to me to be fatal to their view. If so, we are left with those who think that the play is bad, and those who agree in thinking it good, and in placing its goodness almost wholly in the character of the hero, while disagreeing as to what that character is. Surely the devil's advocates are in a very strong position. Here is a play so dominated by one character that Hamlet without the prince is a byword. Here are critics justly framed, all of them for their sensibility, many of them for their skill in catching the finest shades of human passion and pursuing motives into their last hiding places. Is it really credible that the greatest of dramatists, the most powerful painter of men, offering to such an audience his consummate portrait of a man, should produce something which, if any one of them is right, all the rest have in some degree failed to recognize? Is this the sort of thing that happens? Does the meeting of supremely creative with supremely receptive imagination usually produce such results? Or is it not far easier to say that Homer nods, and Alexander's shoulder drooped, and Achilles' heel was vulnerable, and that Shakespeare, for once, either in haste or overreaching himself in unhappy ingenuity, has brought forth an abortion? Yes, of course, it is far easier. Most certainly, says Mr. Eliot, an artistic failure. But is it most certain? Let me return for a moment to my analogy of the picture. In that dream, there was one experiment we did not make. We didn't walk into the next room and look at it for ourselves. Supposing we had done so. Suppose that at the first glance all the cogent arguments of the unfavorable critics had died on our lips or echoed in our ears as idle babble. Suppose that, looking on the picture, we found ourselves caught up in an unforgettable intensity of life and had come back from the room where it hung, haunted forever with the sense of vast dignities and strange sorrows, and teased with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls. Would not this have reversed our judgment and compelled us, in the teeth of a priori probability, to maintain that on one point at least the orthodox critics were in the right? Most certainly an artistic failure. All argument is for that conclusion until you read or see Hamlet again. And when you do, you are left saying that if this is failure, then failure is better than success. We want more of these bad plays. From our first childish reading of the ghost stories, down to those golden minutes which we stole from marking examination papers on Hamlet, to read a few pages of Hamlet itself, have we ever known a day, or the hour, when its enchantment failed? That castle is part of our own world. The affection that we feel for the prince, and through him for Horatio, is like a friendship in real life. The very turns of expression, half-lines and odd connecting links of this play are worked into the language. It appears, said Shaftesbury in 1710, most to have affected English hearts, and has perhaps been oftenest acted. It has a taste of its own, an all-pervading relish, which we recognize even in its smallest fragments, and which, once tasted, we recur to. When we want that taste, no other book will do instead. It may turn out in the end that the thing is not a complete success. This compelling quality in it may coexist with some radical defect. But I doubt if we shall ever be able to say, sad brow and true maid, that it is most certainly a failure. Even if the proposition that it has failed were at last admitted for true, I can think of a few critical truths which most of us would utter with less certainty and with a more divided mind. It seems, then, that we cannot escape from our problem by pronouncing the play bad. On the other hand, the critics, mostly agreeing to place the excellence of it in the delineation of the hero's character, describe that character in a dozen different ways. If they differ so much as to the kind of man whom Shakespeare meant to portray, how can we explain their unanimous praise of the portrayal? I can imagine a sketch so bad that one man thought it was an attempt at a horse, and another thought it was an attempt at a donkey. But what kind of sketch would it have to be which looked like a very good horse to some and like a very good donkey to others? The only solution which occurs to me is that the critics' delight in the play is not in fact due to the delineation of Hamlet's character, but to something else. If the picture which you take for a horse and I for a donkey delights us both, it is probable that what we are both enjoying is the pure line, or the coloring, not the delineation of an animal. If two men who have both been talking to the same woman agree in proclaiming her conversation delightful, though one praises it for its ingenuous innocence and the other for its clever sophistication, I should be inclined to conclude that her conversation had played very little part in the pleasure of either. I should suspect that the lady was nice to look at. I am quite aware that such a suggestion about what has always been thought a one-man play will sound rather like a paradox. But I am not aiming for singularity. Insofar as my own ideas about Shakespeare are worth classifying at all, I confess myself a member of that school which has lately been withdrawing our attention from the characters to fix it on the plays. Dr. Stoll and Professor Wilson Knight, though in very different fashions, have led me in this direction. And Aristotle has long seemed to me simply right when he says that tragedy is not an imitation of men, but of action and life and happiness and misery. By action, he means, no doubt, not what a modern producer would call action, but rather situation. What has attached me to this way of thinking is the fact that it explains my own experience. When I tried to read Shakespeare in my teens, the character criticism of the 19th century stood between me and my enjoyment. There were all sorts of things in the plays which I could have enjoyed, but I had got it into my head that the only proper and grown-up way of appreciating Shakespeare was to be very interested in the truth and the subtlety of his character drawing. A play opened with thunder and lightning and witches on a heath. This was very much in my line, but oh, the disenchantment when I was told, or thought that I was told, that what really ought to concern me was the effect of these witches on Macbeth's character. An Illyrian duke spoke in an air which had just ceased vibrating to the sound of music, words that seemed to come out of the very heart of some golden world of dreamlike passion. But all this was spoiled because the meddlers had told me that it was the portrait of a self-deceiving or unrealistic man, and given me the impression that it was my business to diagnose like a straightener from Erewhon or Vienna, instead of submitting to the charm. Shakespeare offered me a king who could not even sentence a man to banishment without saying, the sly, slow hours shall not determinate the dateless limit of thy dear exile. Left to myself, I would simply have drunk it in and been thankful. That is just how beautiful, willful, passionate, unfortunate kings killed long ago ought to talk. But then again the critic was at my elbow, instilling the pestilential notion that I ought to prize such words chiefly as illustrations of what he called Richard's weakness, and, worse still, inviting me to admire the vulgar, bustling efficiency of Bolingbroke. I am probably being very unjust to the critics in this account. I am not even sure who they were, but somehow or other this was the sort of idea they gave me. I believe they have given it to thousands. As far as I am concerned, it meant that Shakespeare had become, to me for many years, a closed book. Read him in that way I could not, and it was some time before I had the courage to read him in any other way. Only much later, reinforced with a wider knowledge of literature and able now to rate at its true value the humble little outfit of prudential maxims which really underlay much of the talk about Shakespeare's characters, did I return and read him with enjoyment. To one in my position, the opposite movement in criticism came as a kind of Magna Carta. With that help, I have come to one very definite conclusion. I do not say that the characters, especially the comic characters, count for nothing. But the first thing is to surrender oneself to the poetry and the situation. It is only through them that you can reach the characters, and it is for their sake that the characters exist. All conceptions of the characters arrived at, so to speak, in cold blood, by working out what sort of man it would have to be in real life who would act and speak as they do, are, in my opinion, chimerical. The wiseacres who proceed in that way only substitute our own ideas of character in life, which are not often either profound or delectable, for the bright shapes which the poet is actually using. Orsino and Richard II are test cases. Interpretations which compel you to read their speeches with a certain superiority, to lend them a note of insincerity, to strive in any way against their beauty, are self-condemned. Poets do not make beautiful verse in order to have it guide. Both these characters speak golden syllables, wearing rich clothes and standing in the center of the stage. After that they may be wicked, but it can only be with a passionate and poetic wickedness. They may be foolish, but only with follies noble and heroical. For the poetry, the clothes, and the stance are the substance. The character, as it would have to be in real life, is only a shadow. It is often a very distorted shadow. Some of my pupils talked to me about Shakespeare as if the object of his life had been to render into verse the philosophy of Samuel Smiles or Henry Ford. A good example of the kind of play which can be twisted out of recognition by character criticism is The Merchant of Venice. Nothing is easier than to disengage and condemn the mercenary element in Bassanio's original suit to Portia, to point out that Jessica was a bad daughter, and by dwelling on Shylock's wrongs to turn him into a tragic figure. The hero thus becomes a scamp, the heroine's love for him a disaster, the villain a hero, the last act an irrelevance, and the casket story a monstrosity. What is not explained is why anyone should enjoy such a depressing and confused piece of work. It seems to me that what we actually enjoy is something quite different. The real play is not so much about men as about metals. The horror of usury lay in the fact that it treated metal in a way contrary to nature. If you have cattle, they will breed. To make money, a mere medium of exchange, breed as if it were alive, is a sort of black magic. The speech about Laban and Jacob is put into Shylock's mouth to show that he cannot grasp this distinction, and the Christians point out that friendship does not take a breed of barren metal. The important thing about Bassanio is that he can say, "Only my blood speaks to you in my veins," and again, "All the wealth I had ran in my veins." Sir Walter Raleigh, most unhappily to my mind, speaks of Bassanio as a pale shadow. Pale is precisely the wrong word. The whole contrast is between the crimson and organic wealth in his veins, the medium of nobility and fecundity, and the cold mineral wealth in Shylock's counting house. The charge that he is a mercenary wooer is a product of prosaic analysis. The play is much nearer to the Marchand level than that. When the hero marries the princess, we are not expected to ask whether her wealth, her beauty, or her rank was the determining factor. They are all blended together in the simple man's conception of princess. Of course, great ladies are beautiful. Of course they are rich. Bassanio compares Portia to the golden fleece. That strikes the proper note. And when once we approach the play with our senses and imagination, it becomes obvious that the presence of the casket story is no accident, for it is also a story about metals. And the rejection of the commercial metals by Bassanio is a kind of counterpoint to the conquest of Shylock's metallic power by the Lady of the Beautiful Mountain. The very terms in which they are rejected proclaim it. Silver is the pale and common drudge twixt man and man. Gold is hard food for Midas. Midas, who, like Shylock, tried to use as the fuel of life what is in its own nature dead. And the last act, so far from being an irrelevant coda, is almost the thing for which the play exists. The naughty world of finance exists in the play, chiefly that we may perceive the light of the good deed, or rather of the good state, which is called Belmont. I know that some will call this far-fetched, but I must ask them to take my word for it, even if I am wrong. Far-fetched is the last epithet that should be applied to my error. I have not fetched it from far. This, or something like it, is my immediate and spontaneous reaction. A wicked ogre of a Jew is 10,000 miles nearer to that rejection than any of the sad, subtle, and realistic figures produced by critics. If I err in childishness, not in sophistication. Now, Hamlet is a play as nearly opposite to The Merchant as possible. A good way of introducing you to my experience of it will be to tell you the exact point at which anyone else's criticism of it begins to lose my allegiance. It is a fairly definite point. As soon as I find anyone treating the ghost merely as the means whereby Hamlet learns of his father's murder, as soon as a critic leaves us with the impression that some other method of disclosure, the finding of a letter or a conversation with a servant, would have done very nearly as well, I part company with that critic. After that, he may be as learned and sensitive as you please, but his outlook on literature is so remote from mine that he can teach me nothing. Hamlet, for me, is no more separable from his ghost than Macbeth from his witches, or Una from her lion, or Dick Whittington from his cat. The Hamlet formula, so to speak, is not a man who has to avenge his father, but a man who has been given a task by a ghost. Everything else about him is less important than that. If the play did not begin with the cold and darkness and sickening suspense of the ghost scenes, it would be a radically different play. If, on the other hand, only the first act had survived, we should have a very tolerable notion of the play's peculiar quality. I put it to you that everyone's imagination here confirms mine. What is against me is the abstract pattern of motives and characters which we build up as critics, when the actual flavor or tint of the poetry is already fading from our minds. This ghost is different from any other ghost in Elizabethan drama, For, to tell the truth, the Elizabethans in general do their ghosts very badly. It is permanently ambiguous. Indeed, the very word ghost, by putting it in the same class as the ghosts of Kidd and Chapman, nay, by classifying it at all, puts us on the wrong track. It is this thing, this dreaded sight, an illusion, a spirit of health or goblin damned, liable at any moment to assume some other horrible form, which reason could not survive the vision of. Critics have disputed whether Hamlet is sincere when he doubts whether the apparition is his father's ghost or not. I take him to be perfectly sincere. He believes while the thing is present. He doubts when it is away. Doubt, uncertainty, bewilderment to almost any degree is what the ghost creates, not only in Hamlet's mind, but in the minds of the other characters. Shakespeare does not take the concept of ghost for granted, as other dramatists had done. In his play, the appearance of the spectre means a breaking down of the walls of the world and the germination of thoughts that cannot really be thought. Chaos is come again. This does not mean that I'm going to make the ghost the hero, or the play a ghost story, though I might add that a very good ghost story would be, to me, a more interesting thing than a maze of motives. I have started with the ghost because the ghost appears at the beginning of the play, not only to give Hamlet necessary information, but also, and even more, to strike the note. From the platform, we pass to the court scene, and so to Hamlet's first long speech. There are 10 lines of it before we reach what is necessary to the plot, lines about the melting of flesh into a dew, and the divine prohibition of self-slaughter. We have a second ghost scene, after which the play itself, rather than the hero, goes mad for some minutes. We have a second soliloquy on the theme to die, to sleep, and a third on the witching time of night when churchyards yawn. We have the king's effort to pray, and Hamlet's comment on it. We have the ghost's third appearance. Ophelia goes mad and is drowned. Then comes the comic relief, surely the strangest comic relief ever written, comic relief beside an open grave, with a fervent further discussion of suicide, a detailed inquiry into the rate of decomposition, a few clutches of skulls, and then, alas, poor Yorick. On top of this, the hideous fighting in the grave, and then, soon, the catastrophe. I said just now that the subject of the merchant was metals. In the same sense, the subject of Hamlet is death. I do not mean by this that most of the characters die, nor even that life and death are the stakes they play for. That is true of all tragedies. I do not mean that we rise from the reading of the play with the feeling that we have been in cold, empty places, places outside, nocte tacienta late, though that is true. Before I go on to explain myself, let me say that here and throughout my lecture I am most deeply indebted to my friend, Mr. Owen Barfield. I have to make these acknowledgments both to him and to other of my friends so often that I am afraid of their being taken for an affectation. But they are not. The next best thing to being wise oneself is to live in a circle of those who are. That good fortune I have enjoyed for nearly 20 years. The sense in which death is the subject of Hamlet will become apparent if we compare it with other plays. Macbeth has commerce with hell, but at the very outset of his career dismisses all thought of the life to come. For Brutus, as for Othello, suicide in the high tragic manner is escape and climax. For Lear, death is deliverance. For Romeo, for Antony, poignant loss. For all these, as for their author while he writes and the audience while they watch, death is the end. It is almost the frame of the picture. They think of dying. No one thinks in these plays of being dead. In Hamlet, we are kept thinking about it all the time, whether in terms of the soul's destiny or of the body's. Purgatory, hell, heaven, the wounded name, the rights or wrongs of Ophelia's burial, and the staying power of a tanner's corpse, and beyond this, beyond all Christian and all pagan maps of the hereafter, comes a curious groping and tapping of thoughts about what dreams may come. It is this that gives to the whole play its quality of darkness and of misgiving. Of course there is much else in the play, but nearly always the same groping. The characters are all watching one another, forming theories about one another, listening, contriving, full of anxiety. The world of Hamlet is a world where one has lost one's way. The prince also has no doubt lost his, and we can tell the precise moment at which he finds it again. Not a whit. We defy augury. There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man has aught of what he leaves. What is it to leave betimes? End quote. Footnote. I think the last clause is best explained by the assumption that Shakespeare has come across Seneca's, long quote here in Latin that I can't read. End of footnote. If I wanted to make one more addition to the gallery of Hamlet's portraits, I should trace his hesitation to the fear of death, not to a physical fear of dying, but to a fear of being dead. And I think I should get on quite comfortably. Any serious attention to the state of being dead, unless it is limited by some definite religious or anti-religious doctrine, must, I suppose, paralyze the will by introducing infinite uncertainties and rendering all motives inadequate. Being dead is the unknown X in our sum. Unless you ignore it, or else give it value, you can get no answer. But this is not what I am going to do. Shakespeare has not left in the text clear lines of causation which would enable us to connect Hamlet's hesitation with this source. I do not believe he has given us data for any portrait of the kind critics have tried to draw. To that extent I agree with Hanmer, Rumelin, and Mr. Eliot, but I differ from them in thinking that it is a fault. For what, after all, is happening to us when we read any of Hamlet's great speeches? We see visions of the flesh dissolving into a dew, of the world like an unweeded garden. We think of memory reeling in its distracted globe. We watch him scampering hither and thither like a maniac to avoid the voices wherewith he is haunted. Someone says, "Walk out of the air," and we hear the words, "Into my grave," spontaneously respond to it. We think of being bounded in a nutshell and the king of infinite space, but for bad dreams. There's the trouble, for, quote, "I am most dreadfully attended," end quote. We see the picture of a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, a John of dreams, somehow unable to move while ultimate dishonor is done him. We listen to his fear lest the whole thing may be an illusion due to melancholy. We get the sense of sweet relief at the words shuffled off this mortal coil, but mixed with the bottomless doubt about what may follow then. We think of bones and skulls, of women breeding sinners, and of how some, to whom all this experience is a sealed book, yet dare death and danger for an eggshell. But do we really enjoy these things? Do we go back to them because they show us Hamlet's character? Are they, from that point of view, so very interesting? Does the mere fact that a young man, literally haunted, dispossessed, and lacking friends, should feel thus, tell us anything remarkable? Let me put my question in another way. If instead of the speeches he actually utters about the firmament and man in his scene with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet had merely said, "I don't seem to enjoy things the way I used to," and talked in that fashion throughout, should we find him interesting? I think the answer is not very. It may be replied that if he talked commonplace prose, he would reveal his character less vividly. I am not so sure. He would certainly have revealed something less vividly. But would that something be himself? It seems to me that this majestical roof and what a piece of work is man give me primarily an impression not of the sort of person he must be to lose the estimation of things, but of the things themselves and their great value, and that I should be able to discern, though with very faint interest, the same condition of loss in a personage who was quite unable so to put before me what he was losing. And I do not think it true to reply that he would be a different character if he spoke less poetically. This point is often misunderstood. We sometimes speak as if the characters in whose mouths Shakespeare puts great poetry were poets, in the sense that Shakespeare was depicting men of poetical genius. But surely this is like thinking that Wagner's Wotan is the dramatic portrait of a baritone. In opera, song is the medium by which representation is made, not part of the thing represented. The actors sing. The dramatic personages are feigned to be speaking. The only character who sings dramatically in Figaro is Cherubino. Similarly, in poetic drama, poetry is the medium, not part of the delineated characters. While the actors speak poetry written for them by the poet, the dramatic personages are supposed to be merely talking. If ever there is an occasion to represent poetry, as in the play scene from Hamlet, it is put into a different meter and strongly stylized so as to prevent confusion. I trust that my conception is now becoming clear. I believe that we read Hamlet's speeches with interest, chiefly because they describe so well a certain spiritual region through which most of us have passed, and anyone in his circumstance might be expected to pass, rather than because of our concern to understand how and why this particular man entered it. I foresee an objection on the ground that I am thus really admitting his character in the only sense that matters, and that all characters whatever could be equally well talked away by the method I have adopted. But I do not really find a distinction. When I read about Mrs. Proudie, I am not in the least interested in seeing the world from her point of view, for her point of view is not interesting. What does interest me is precisely the sort of person she was. In Middlemarch, no reader wants to see Casaubon through Dorothea's eyes. The pathos, the comedy, the value of the whole thing is to understand Dorothea, and to see how such an illusion was inevitable for her. In Shakespeare himself, I find Beatrice to be a character who could not be thus dissolved. We are interested not in some vision seen through her eyes, but precisely in the wonder of her being the girl she is. A comparison of the sayings we remember from her part with those we remember from Hamlet's brings out the contrast. On the one hand, I wonder that you will still be talking, Signor Benedick. There was a star danced, and unto that I was born. Kill Claudio. On the other, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. Use every man after his desert, and who should scape with whipping? The rest is silence. Particularly noticeable is the passage where Hamlet professes to be describing his own character. Quote, I am myself indifferent honest, but yet I could accuse me of such things that it were better my mother had not borne me. I am very proud, revengeful, ambitious. End quote. It is, of course, possible to devise some theory which explains these self-accusations in terms of character. But long before we have done so, the real significance of the lines has taken possession of our imagination forever. Such fellows as I does not mean such fellows as Goethe's Hamlet or Coleridge's Hamlet or any Hamlet. It means men, creatures shapen in sin and conceived in iniquity. And the vast empty vision of them crawling between earth and heaven is what really counts and what really carries the burden of the play. It is often cast in the teeth of the great critics that each in painting Hamlet has drawn a portrait of himself. How if they were right? I would go a long way to meet Beatrice or Falstaff or Mr. Jonathan Oldbuck or Disraeli's Lord Monmouth. I would not cross the room to meet Hamlet. It would never be necessary. He is always where I am. The method of the whole play is much nearer to Mr. Eliot's own method in poetry than Mr. Eliot suspects. Its true hero is man, haunted man, man with his mind on the frontier of two worlds, man unable quite either to reject or quite to admit the supernatural, man struggling to get something done as man has struggled from the beginning, yet incapable of achievement because of his inability to understand either himself or his fellows or the real quality of the universe which has produced him. To be sure, some hints of more particular motives for Hamlet's delay are every now and then fadged up to silence our questions, just as some show of motives is offered for the Duke's temporary abdication in Measure for Measure. In both cases, it is only scaffolding or machinery. To mistake these mere succedanea for the real play, and to try to work them into a coherent psychology, is a great error. I once had a whole batch of school certificate answers on the Nun's Priest's Tale by boys whose form master was apparently a breeder of poultry. Everything that Chaucer had said in describing Chanticleer and Pertelote was treated by them simply and solely as evidence about the precise breed of these two birds. And I must admit, the result was very interesting. They proved beyond doubt that Chanticleer was very different from our modern specialized strains and much closer to the Old English barn door fowl. But I couldn't help feeling that they had missed something. I believe our attention to Hamlet's character, in the usual sense, misses almost as much. Perhaps I should rather say that it would miss as much if our behavior when we were actually reading were not wiser, much wiser, than our criticism in cold blood. The critics, or most of them, have at any rate kept constantly before us the knowledge that in this play there is greatness and mystery. They were never entirely wrong. Their error, in my view, was to put the mystery in the wrong place, in Hamlet's motives, rather than that darkness which enwraps Hamlet, and the whole tragedy and all who read or watch it. It is a mysterious play in the sense of being a play about mystery. Mr. Eliot suggests that more people have thought Hamlet a work of art because they found it interesting than have found it interesting because it is a work of art. When he wrote that sentence, he must have been very near to what I believe to be the truth. The play is, above all else, interesting. But artistic failure is not in itself interesting, nor often interesting in any way. Artistic success always is. To interest is the first duty of art. No other excellences will even begin to compensate for failure in this, and very serious faults will be covered by this, as by charity. The hypothesis that this play interests by being good, and not by being bad, has therefore the first claim upon our consideration. The burden of proof rests on the other side. Is not the fascinated interest of the critics most naturally explained by supposing that this is the precise effect the play was written to produce? They may be finding the mystery in the wrong place, but the fact that they can never leave Hamlet alone, the continual groping, the sense unextinguished by over a century of failures that we have here something of inestimable importance, is surely the best evidence that the long and lasting mystery of our human situation has been greatly depicted. The kind of criticism which I have attempted is always at a disadvantage against either historical criticism or character criticism. Their vocabulary has been perfected by long practice, and the truths with which they are concerned are those which we are accustomed to handle in the everyday business of life. But the things I want to talk about have no vocabulary, and criticism for centuries has kept almost complete silence on them. Professor Wilson Knight, though I disagree with nearly everything he says in detail, Miss Spurgeon, Miss Bodkin, and Mr. Barfield are my leaders. But those who do not enjoy the honors of a pioneer may yet share his discomforts. One of them I feel acutely at the moment. I feel certain that to many of you the things I have been saying about Hamlet will appear intolerably sophisticated, abstract, and modern. And so they sound when they have been put into words. But I shall have failed completely if I cannot persuade you that my view, for good or ill, has just the opposite characteristics. It is naive and concrete and archaic. I am trying to recall attention from the things an intellectual adult notices to the things a child or a peasant notices. Night, ghosts, a castle, a lobby where a man can walk 4 hours together, a willow-fringed brook and a sad lady drowned, a graveyard and a terrible cliff above the sea, and amidst all these, a pale man in black clothes, would that our producers would ever let him appear, with his stockings coming down, a disheveled man whose words make us at once think of loneliness and doubt and dread, of waste and dust and emptiness, and from whose hands, or from our own, we feel the richness of heaven and earth and the sense of human affection slipping away. In a sense, I have kept my promise of bestowing all my childishness upon you. A child is always thinking about those details in a story which a grown-up regards as indifferent. If, when you first told the tale, your hero was warned by 3 little men appearing on the left of the road, and when you tell it again you introduce 1 little man on the right side of the road, the child protests, and the child is right. You think it makes no difference because you are not living in the story at all. If you were, you would know better. Motifs, machines, and the like are abstractions of literary history and therefore interchangeable, but concrete imagination knows nothing of them. You must not think I am setting up a sort of literary Peter Pan who does not grow up. On the contrary, I claim that only those adults who have retained, with whatever additions and enrichments, their first childish response to poetry, unimpaired, can be said to have grown up at all. Mere change is not growth. Growth is the synthesis of change and continuity. And where there is no continuity, there is no growth. To hear some critics, one would suppose that a man had to lose his nursery appreciation of Gulliver before he acquired his mature appreciation of it. It is not so. If it were, the whole concept of maturity, of ripening, would be out of place. And also, I believe we should very seldom read more than 3 pages of Gulliver at a sitting.
4. Kipling's World. An address to the English Association. Kipling is intensely loved and hated. Hardly any reader likes him a little. Those who admire him will defend him tooth and nail and resent unfavorable criticism of him as if he were a mistress or a country rather than a writer. The other side reject him with something like personal hatred. The reason is not hard to find, and will, I hope, become apparent as we go on. For the moment, I will only say that I do not fully belong to either side. I have been reading him off and on all my life, and I never return to him without renewed admiration. I have never at any time been able to understand how a man of taste could doubt that Kipling is a very great artist. On the other hand, I have never quite taken him into my heart. He is not one of my indispensables. Life would go on much the same if the last copy of his work disappeared. I can go even further than this. Not only is my allegiance imperfect, it is also inconstant. After I have been reading Kipling for some days together, there comes a sudden check. One moment I'm filled with delight at the variety and solidity of his imagination, and then at the very next moment I am sick to death of the whole Kipling world. Of course, one can reach temporary saturation point with any author. There comes an evening when even Boswell or Virgil will do no longer. But one parts from them as a friend. One knows one will want them another day, and in an interval one thinks of them with pleasure. But I mean something quite different from that. I mean a real disenchantment, a recoil, which makes the Kipling world, for the moment, not dull, it's never that, but unendurable, a heavy, glaring, suffocating monstrosity. It is the difference between feeling that, on the whole, you would not like another slice of bread and butter just now, and wondering, as your gorge rises, how you could ever have imagined that you liked vodka. I by no means assume that this sudden change of feeling is reasonable, but it must certainly have causes, and I hope that to explore them may cast some light on Kipling. I am going to suggest that they are two in number, one arising from what may be called the formal, the other from what may be called the material character of his work. I admit that this distinction of form from matter breaks down if you press it too far, or in certain directions, but I think it will do for the purpose I have in hand. The first cause for my sudden recoil from Kipling I take to be not the defect, but the excess of his art. He himself has told us how he licked every story into its final shape. He dipped a brush in India ink and then reread the manuscript in an auspicious hour, considering faithfully every paragraph, sentence, and word, and blacking out where requisite. After a time he reread the story and usually found that it would bear a second shortening. Finally there came a third reading, at which still more deletion might or might not be found necessary. This from his autobiography, chapter 8. It is a magnificent example of self-discipline, which Horace would have approved. But I suggest that even an athlete can be overtrained. Superfluous flesh should be sweated off, but a cruel trainer may be too severe in judging what is superfluous. I think Kipling used the India ink too much. Sometimes the story has been so compressed that in the completed version it's not quite told. At least I still do not know what exactly happened in Mrs. Bathurst. But even when this is not so, the art overreaches itself in another way. Every sentence that did not seem to Kipling perfectly and triumphantly good has been removed. As a result, the style tends to be too continuously and obtrusively brilliant. The result is a little fatiguing. Our author gives us no rest. We're bombarded with felicities till they deafen us. There's no elbow room, no leisureliness. We need roughage as well as nourishment in our diet, but there is no roughage in a Kipling story. It's all unrelieved vitamins from the first word to the last. To this criticism, I think Kipling could make an almost perfectly satisfactory answer. He might say that he was writing short stories and short poems, each of which was to be the only specimen of Kipling in some number of a periodical. His work was meant to be taken in small doses. The man who gobbles down one story after another at a sitting has no more right to complain if the result is disastrous than the man who swills liqueurs as if they were beer. This answer, I have said, seems to me almost complete. Almost, because even inside a single story, the brilliance of the parts, in my opinion, sometimes damages the effect of the whole. I am thinking of My Sunday at Home. The fancied situation is excellent. One ought to remember the story with chuckles as one remembers The Wrong Box. But I know I am not alone in finding that one actually laughed less than one would have thought possible in the reading of it, and that in remembering it one always reverts to the summer drowsiness of the Wiltshire country around the railway station. That superb piece of scene painting has almost blotted out the comic action. Yet I suppose it was originally introduced for no other purpose than to emphasize the solitude of the place. The fault of which I am here accusing Kipling is one which only a great artist could commit. For most of us, the old rule of cutting out every word that can be spared is still a safe one. There is no danger that even after this process, the result will be too vivid and too full of sense. And as far as mere art is concerned, I think that this is almost the only fault I can find with Kipling's mature work. I say his mature work, for of course, like all men, he made some unsuccessful experiments before he found his true vein. It is when I turn to his matter that my serious discontents begin. The earliest generation of Kipling's readers regarded him as the mouthpiece of patriotism and imperialism. I think that conception of his work is inadequate. Chesterton did a great service to criticism by contradicting it in a famous chapter of Heretics. In that chapter, he finds the essential characteristics of Kipling's mind to be two. In the first place, he had discovered, or rediscovered, the poetry of common things, had perceived, as Chesterton says, the significance and philosophy of steam and of slang. In the second place, Kipling was the poet of discipline, not specially or exclusively of military discipline, but of discipline of every shape. He has not written so well of soldiers, says Chesterton, as he has of railwaymen or bridge builders or even journalists. This particular judgment may be disputed, but I have no doubt at all that Chesterton has picked up the right scent. To put the thing in the shortest possible way, Kipling is first and foremost the poet of work. It is really remarkable how poetry and fiction before his time had avoided this subject. They had dealt almost exclusively with men in their private hours, with love affairs, crimes, sport, illness, and changes of fortune. Mr. Osborne may be a merchant, but Vanity Fair has no interest in his mercantile life. Darcy was a good landlord and Wentworth a good officer, but their activities in these capacities were all off stage. Most of Scott's characters, except for the soldiers, have no profession, and when they are soldiers, the emphasis is on the battles and the adventures, not on the professional routine. Business comes into Dickens only so far as it is criminal or comic. With a few exceptions, of which Middlemarch is probably the finest, imaginative literature in the 18th and 19th centuries had quietly omitted, or at least thrust into the background, the sort of thing which in fact occupies most of the waking hours of most men. And this did not merely mean that certain technical aspects of life were unrepresented. A whole range of strong sentiments and emotions, for many men the strongest of all, went with them. For, as Pepys once noted with surprise, there is a great pleasure in talking of business. It was Kipling who first reclaimed for literature this enormous territory. His early stories of Anglo-Indian society still conform to the older convention. They are about love affairs, elopements, intrigues, and domestic quarrels. They are indeed connected with his later and more characteristic work by a thread which I shall discuss presently, but on the surface they are a different kind of thing. The departmental ditties are much more typical of the author's real interests. The point about Potiphar Gubbins is not simply that he is a cuckold, but that his horns bring him advancement in the civil service and that he builds very bad bridges. The sting of the story of Uriah lies not merely in the wife's depravity, but in the fact that the husband was sent, for the lover's convenience, to die at Quetta, attempting two men's duty in that very healthy post. Exeter Battleby Tring, who really knows something about railways, has his mouth silenced with rupees, in order that the little tin gods, long may their highnesses thrive, may keep their circle intact. Boanerges Blitzen ruins his official career by exposing office scandals in the papers. The whole bitter little collection presents a corrupt society not in its leisure, but in its official corruption. In his later work, this preference for depicting men at their jobs becomes his most obvious characteristic. Finlayson's hopes and fears about his bridge, McPhee's attitude, both to engines and owners, William the Conqueror's work in the famine district, a lighthouse keeper at his post on a foggy night, Gisborne and his chief in the forest, MacAndrew standing his watch. These are the things that come back to us when we remember Kipling, and there had really been nothing like them in literature before. The poems, again and again, strike the same note. Lord Dufferin, heavily influenced by Bishop Blougram, hands on the Arcana Imperii to Lord Lansdowne. The professional spies set out each man reporting for duty alone, out of sight, out of reach of his fellow. The crew of the Bolivar, mad with work and weariness, see some damned liner's lights go by like a grand hotel. H. Mukherjee sends with the bow's head a covering letter in perfect Babu officialese. The fans and beltings in a munition factory roar around a widowed war worker. The rhythms of work, boots slogging along a road, the herald and the hoe delivering their league-long paper bale, the grunting of the water wheel, echo through Kipling's verse and prose as through no other man's. Even Mowgli, in the end, accepts a post in the civil service. Even the brushwood boy turns aside from its main theme to show how much toil its hero suffered and inflicted in the course of his profession. Even when we are taken into the remote past, Kipling is not interested in imagining what it felt like to be an ancient pagan man, only in what it felt like to be a man doing some ancient job, a galley slave, a Roman officer, how the light came in through the oar holes in the galley, that little detail which everyone who has served in a galley would remember and which no one else would know. That is Kipling's quarry. It would be a mistake, however, to accuse Kipling of swamping the human interest in his mass of material and technical detail. The detail is there for the sake of a human interest, but that human interest is one that no previous writer had done justice to. What Kipling chiefly communicates, and it is for good and for ill one of the strongest things in the world, is the peculiar relation which men who do the same work have to that work and to one another, the inescapable bond of shared experiences, and above all, of shared hardships. It is a commitment for life. Oh, was there ever sailor free to choose that didn't settle somewhere near the sea? We've only one virginity to lose, and where we lost it, there our hearts will be. That is why in Steam Tactics, Hinchcliffe, who, when starting on his leave, had thanked his maker that he wouldn't see or smell nor thumb a runnin' bowling until the 19th prox, nevertheless fell immediately to studying the engine of Kipling's steam car. For the same reason, Kipling, the old journalist, writes, "But the Jew shall forget Jerusalem ere we forget the press." In the next stanza he goes on to explain why. The man who has stood through the loaded hour and lit his pipe in the morning calm, who has in fact been through the nocturnal routine of producing a paper, hath sold his heart. That is the whole point. We who are of one trade, whether journalists, soldiers, galley slaves, Indian civilians, or what you will, know so many things that outsiders will never understand. Like the two child lovers in The Light That Failed, we belong. It is a bond which in real life sometimes proves stronger than any other. The men of my own stock, they may do ill or well, but they tell the lies I am wanted to. They are used to the lies I tell, and we do not need interpreters when we go to buy or sell. How true to life is the immediate alliance of three journalists, whom chance has thrown together in the story called A Matter of Fact. This spirit of the profession is everywhere shown in Kipling as a ruthless master. That is why Chesterton got in a very large part of the truth when he fixed on discipline as Kipling's main subject. There is nothing Kipling describes with more relish than the process whereby the trade spirit licks some raw cub into shape. That is the whole theme of one of his few full-length novels, Captains Courageous. It is the theme of the centaurs, and of Pharaoh and the Sergeant, and of the Ethan. It is allegorically expressed in The Ship That Found Herself. It is implicit in all the army stories and the sea stories. Indeed, it may be thought that the author turns aside from his narrative rather too often to assure us that Mulvaney was invaluable for licking the new batch of recruits into shape. Even when we escape into the jungle and the wolf pack, we do not escape the law. Until he has been disciplined, put through it, licked into shape, a man is, for Kipling, mere raw material. "Gad," says Hitchcock to Finlayson in The Bridge Builders, "what a Cooper's Hill cub I was when I came to the works." And Finlayson muses, "Cub thou wast, assistant thou art." The philosophy of the thing is summed up at the end of A Walking Delicate, where the yellow horse, an agitator, has said to the old walking horse, "Have ye no respect whatever for the dignity of our common horsehood?" He gets the reply, "Horse, sonny, is what you start from. We all know about horse here, and he ain't any high-toned, pure-souled child of nature. Horse, plain horse, same as you, is chock full of tricks and meanness and cussedness and monkey shines. That's horse, and that's about his dignity in the sight of his soul, for he's been broken rawhide to piece." Reading man for horse, we here have Kipling's doctrine of man. This is one of the most important things Kipling has to say, and one which he means very seriously, and it is also one of the things which has aroused hatred against him. It amounts to something like the doctrine of original sin, and it is antipathetic to many modern modes of thought. Perhaps even more antipathetic is Kipling's presentation of the breaking and rawhiding process. In his private honor, it turns out to consist of prolonged bullying and incessant abuse, the sort of bullying, as we learn from the Even, which sends grown men off to cry in solitude, followed by the jeers of the old hands. The patient is not allowed to claim any personal rights whatever. There is nothing, according to Kipling, more subversive. To ask for justice is as the sin of witchcraft. The disaster in the poem called That Day began with the fact that every little drummer had his rights and wrongs to mind. In contrast, "My rights," Authorised answered with deep scorn. "My rights? I ain't a recruited to go whining about my rights to this and my rights to that just as if I couldn't look after myself. My rights? 'Struth almighty, I'm a man." Now, there is no good whatever in dismissing this part of Kipling's message as if it were not worth powder and shot. There is a truth in it, which must be faced, before we attempt to find any larger truths which it may exclude. Many who hate Kipling have omitted this preliminary. They feel instinctively that they themselves are just the unlicked or unbroken men whom Kipling condemns. They find the picture intolerable, and the picture of the cure more intolerable still. To escape, they dismiss the whole thing as mere fascist or public school brutality. But there is no solution along those lines. It may or may not be possible to get beyond Kipling's harsh wisdom, but there is no getting beyond a thing without first getting as far. It is a brutal truth about the world that the whole everlasting business of keeping the human race protected and clothed and fed could not go on for 24 hours without this vast legion of hard-bitten, technically efficient, not overly sympathetic men, and without the harsh process of discipline by which this legion is made. It is a brutal truth that unless a great many people practice the Kipling ethos, there would be neither security nor leisure for any people to practice a finer ethos. As Chesterton admits, we may fling ourselves into a hammock in a fit of divine carelessness, but we are glad that the maker of the hammock did not make it in a fit of divine carelessness. In the Proconsuls, speaking of those who have actually ruled with the strong hand, Kipling says, "On the stage their act hath framed for thy sports, O liberty. Doubted are they and defamed, by their tongues their act set free." It is a true bill, as far as it goes. Unless the Kipling virtues, if you will, the Kipling vices, had long and widely been practiced in the world, we should be in no condition to sit here and discuss Kipling. If all men stood talking of their rights before they went up a mast or down a sewer or stoked a furnace or joined an army, we should all perish. Nor while they talked of their rights would they learn to do these things. And I think we must agree with Kipling that the man preoccupied with his own rights is not only a disastrous but a very unlovely object. Indeed, one of the worst mischiefs we can do by treating a man unjustly is that we force him to be thus preoccupied. But if so, then it is all the more important that men should in fact be treated with justice. If we all need licking into shape, and if while undergoing the process we must not guard our rights, then it is all the more important that someone else should guard them for us. What has Kipling to say on this subject? For quite clearly, the very same methods which he prescribes for licking the cub into shape, making a man out of him in the interests of the community, would also, if his masters were bad men, be an admirable method of keeping the cub quiet while he was exploited and enslaved for their private benefit. It is all very well that the colts in the centaurs should learn to obey Chiron as a means to becoming good cavalry chargers, but how if Chiron wants their obedience only to bring them to the knacker's yard? And are the masters never bad men? For some stories one would almost conclude that Kipling is ignorant of or indifferent to this possibility. In his private honor, the old soldiers educate the recruits by constant bullying. But Kipling seems quite unaware that the bullying is the activity which some humans enjoy. We are given to understand that the old soldiers are wholly immune to this temptation. They threaten and mock and thrash the recruits only from the highest possible motives. Is this naivety in the author? Can he really be so ignorant, or does he not care? He is certainly not ignorant. Most of us begin by regarding Kipling as the panegyrist of the whole imperial system. But we find when we look into the matter that his admiration is reserved for those in the lower positions. These are the men on the spot, the bearers of the burden, Above them we find folly and ignorance. At the center of the whole thing we find the terrible society of Simla, a provincial smart set which plays frivolously with men's careers and even their lives. The system is rotten at the head, and official advancement may have a teterima causa, highest motive. Finlayson had to see months of office work destroyed at a blow when the government of India at the last moment added 2 feet to the width of the bridge, under the impression that bridges were cut out of paper. The heart-rending death of Orda, one of Kipling's tragic scenes, is followed by the undoing of his life's work, when an ignorant viceroy sends a babu to succeed him. In Todd's Amendment, disaster is averted by a child who knows what all the rulers of India, the little tin gods, do not know. It is interesting to compare the heathen with the sergeant's wedding. In the one, the sergeants are benevolent despots. It's only the softness and selfishness of the recruit that make him think they are cruel tyrants. In the other, we have a sergeant who uses his position to make money by cheating the men. Clearly, this sergeant would have just as strong a motive as the good ones for detesting the privates who talked about their rights and wrongs. All this suggests that the disciplinary system is a very two-edged affair, but this does not in the least shake Kipling's devotion to it. That, he says in effect, is what the world has always been like and always will be like. Even in prehistoric times, the astute person won a simple viceroy's praise through the toil of other men. And no one can rebuke more stunningly than Kipling those who exploit and frustrate the much-enduring man on the spot. When the last grim joke is entered in the big black book of jobs, and Quetta graveyards give again their victims to the air, I shouldn't like to be the man who sent Jack Barrett there. But this makes no difference to the duty of the sufferer. Whatever corruptions there may be at the top, the work must go on. Frontiers must be protected, epidemics fought, bridges built, marshes drained, famine relief administered. Protest, however well grounded about injustice and schemes of reform, will never bring a ship into harbor, or a train into the station, or sow a field of oats or quell a riot, and the unforgiving minute is upon us 1,440 times a day. This is the truest and finest element in Kipling, his version of Carlyle's Gospel of Work. It has affinities with Piers Plowman's insistence on plowing his half-acre. But there are important differences. The more Kipling convinces us that no plea for justice or happiness must be allowed to interfere with the job, the more anxious we become for a reassurance that the work is really worth all the human sacrifices it demands. The game, he says, is more than the player of the game. But perhaps some games are and some aren't. And the ship is more than the crew. But one would like to know where the ship is going and why. Was its voyage really useful, or even innocent? We want, in fact, a doctrine of ends. Langland could supply one. He knows how do well is connected with do bet and do best. The plowing of the half-acre is placed in a cosmic context, and that context would enable Langland in principle to tell us whether any given job in the whole universe was true worship or miserable idolatry. It is here that Kipling speaks with an uncertain voice. For many of the things done by his civil servants, the necessity is perhaps obvious, but that is not the side of the matter he develops. And he writes with equal relish where the ultimate ends of the work described are much less obvious. Sometimes his choice of sides seems to be quite arbitrary, even frivolous. When William the Conqueror met a schoolmaster who had to teach the natives the beauties of Wordsworth's excursions, she told him, rather unnecessarily, "I like men who do things." In other words, teaching English literature to natives is not doing things, and we are meant to despise that schoolmaster. One notes that the editor of the local paper, whom we met a few pages before, is visited with no similar ignominy. Background. Yet it is easy to imagine the situations reversed. Kipling could have written a perfect Kipling story about two men in the educational department working 18 hours a day to conduct an examination with punka flapping and all the usual background. The futility of the curriculum, which makes them set Wordsworth to Indian schoolboys, would not in the least have detracted from their heroism, if he had chosen to write the story from that point of view. It would have been their professional grievance, ironically and stoically endured, one more instance of that irresponsible folly at the top which wastes and breaks the men who really do the work. I have a disquieting feeling that Kipling's actual respect for the journalist and contempt for the schoolmaster has no thought-out doctrine of ends behind it, but results from the accident that he himself worked for a newspaper and not for a school. And now at last I begin to suspect that we are finding a clue to that suffocating sensation which overtakes me if I read Kipling too long. Is the Kipling world really monstrous in the sense of being misshaped? How if this doctrine of work and discipline, which is so clear and earnest and dogmatic at the periphery, hides at the center a terrible vagueness, a frivolity, or even skepticism? Sometimes it hides nothing but what the English, whether fairly or unfairly, are inclined to call Americanism. The story called Below the Mill Dam is an instance. We are expected to rejoice that the native black rat should be superseded by the alien brown rat, that the mill wheel could be yoked to a dynamo and the country electrified. None of the questions which every thinking man must raise about the beneficence of this whole transition have any meaning for Kipling. They are to him mere excuses for idleness. "We have already learned 6 refined synonyms for loafing," say the waters, and to the wheel itself, "While you're at work, you'll work." The black rat is to be stuffed. Here is the creed of activism, of progress, hustle, and development, all blind, naked, uncritical of itself. Similarly in The Explorer, while we admire the man's courage in the earlier stanzas, the end which he has in view gives us pause. His holy grail is simply the industrialization of the country he has discovered. The waterfalls are wasting 50,000 head an hour, and the forests are axe-ripe. He will rectify this. The end, here as in the mill dam story, may be a good one. It's not for me to decide. But Kipling doesn't seem to know there's any question. In Bread Upon the Waters, all the usual hardships are described, and with all of Kipling's usual relish, but the only end is money and revenge, though I confess a very excusable revenge. In The Devil in the Deep Sea, the job, which is treated with his usual reverence, the game, which is still more than the player of the game, is merely the triumph of a gang of criminals. This might be explained by saying that Kipling is not a moralist, but a purely objective writer. But that would be false. He is eminently a moralist. In almost every story we are invited, nay forced, to admire and condemn. Many of the poems are versified homilies. That is why this chanciness or uncertainty about the end to which the moralism of his Bushido is applied in any particular instance makes us uncomfortable. And now we must take a step farther. Even discipline is not a constant. The very people who would be cubs licked into shape in one story may in another be the heroes we are asked to admire. Stalky and his friends are inveterate breakers of discipline. How easily, had his own early memories been different, could Kipling have written the story the other way round? In Their Lawful Occasions, Moorshed, because he is rich and able to leave the Navy next year, can afford to take an independent line. All Kipling's sympathy is with him and against the ship, which is significantly named the HMS Pedantic. Yet Kipling need only have altered the lighting, so to speak, to make Moorshed and the grounds of his independence particularly odious, and the odium would have been of a characteristically Kiplingese kind. In Without Benefit of Clergy, Holden's inefficiency as a civil servant is made light of. But had Kipling written in a different mood, the very cause of this inefficiency, namely keeping a native mistress, would have been made into a despicable aggravation. In the actual story, it is almost an excuse. In The Germ Destroyer, we actually find Kipling laughing at a man because he has a marked passion for work. In The Basara of Puri, that whole Anglo-Indian world, whose work for the natives elsewhere seems so necessary and valuable, is contrasted with the natives as the shiny top scum stuff that people call civilization. In The Dream of Duncan Paranus, the apparition offers the hero success in the Anglo-Indian career in return for his trust in man, his faith in woman, and his boy's conscience. He gives them all and receives in return a little piece of dry bread. Where is now the Kipling we thought we knew, the prophet of work, the activist, the writer of If, were it not better done as others use? You may say that some of these examples are taken from early stories. Perhaps Kipling held these skeptical views in his youth and abandoned them in his maturity. Perhaps, as I once half believed myself, he is a lost leader, a great opposition writer who was somehow caught by government. I think there was a change in his views, but I do not think that goes to the root of the matter. I think that nearly all his work, for there are a few and very valuable exceptions, at all periods is dominated by one master passion. What he loves better than anything in the world is the intimacy within a closed circle, even if it be only a circle of shared misery, as in the Same Boat, or of shared crime, as in The Devil in the Deep Sea. In the last resort, I do not think he loves professional brotherhood for the sake of the work. I think he loves work for the sake of professional brotherhood. Out of that passion, all his apparently contradictory moods arise. But I must attempt to define the passion itself a little more closely and to show how it has such a diversified offspring. When we foregather with 3 or 4 trusted cronies of our own calling, a strong sense of community arises and is enjoyed. But that enjoyment can be prolonged by several different kinds of conversation. We may all be engaged in standing together against the outer world, all those fools outside who write newspaper articles about us which reveal their ghastly ignorance of the real work, and propose schemes which look very fine on paper but which, as we well know, are impracticable. As long as that conversation lasts, the profession appears a very fine one, and its achievements very remarkable, if only those yapping outsiders would leave us alone to get on with the job. And that conversation, if we could do it well enough, would make one kind of Kipling story. But we might equally spend the evening standing together against our own seniors, those people at the top. Lord knows how they got there, while better men rot in provincial lectureships or small ships or starving parishes, who seem to have forgotten what the real work is like, and who spoil all our best efforts with their meddling and are quite deceived about our relative merits. And while that conversation lasted, our profession would appear a very rotten and heartbreaking profession. We might even say it was high time the public learned the sorts of things that really go on. A rousing scandal might do good. And out of all that, another kind of Kipling story might be made. But then, some other evening, or later the same evening, we might all be standing together against our juniors. As if by magic, our profession would now once more appear in a favorable light, at least our profession as it used to be. What may happen with the sort of young cubs we're getting into it nowadays is another question. They need licking into shape. They'll have to learn to pull their socks up. They haven't yet begun to realize what's expected of them. And heaven knows things are made easy enough for them now. They haven't been through the sort of mill we were through. By George, if they'd worked under old so-and-so. And thus yet another Kipling story might arise. But we sometimes like talking about our juniors in exactly the opposite way. We have been in the job so long that we have no illusions about it. We know that half the official regulations are dead letters. Nobody will thank you for doing more than you need. Our juniors are laughably full of zeal, pedantic about discipline, devoured with a morbid passion for work. Ah, well, they'll soon get over it. Now, the point is that the similarity between all these conversations is overwhelmingly more important than the differences. It may well be chance which launches the evening on one of them rather than another, for they all give the same sort of pleasure, and that is the kind of pleasure which the great majority of Kipling's works both express and communicate. I am tempted to describe it as the pleasure of Freemasonry, but this would be confusing because Kipling became a Mason in the narrower and official sense. But in the wider sense, you may say that he was born a Mason. One of the stories that pleased his childhood was significantly about lions who were all Freemasons, and in confederacy against some wicked baboon. The pleasure of confederacy against wicked baboons, or even of confederacy by itself, is the cardinal fact about the Kipling world. To belong, to be inside, to be in the know, to be snugly together against the outsiders, that is what really matters. It's almost an accident who are cast for the role of outsiders, wicked baboons, on any given occasion. And no one before Kipling had fully celebrated the potency of that snugness, the esoteric comedies and tragedies, the mutual understanding, the highly specialized smile or shrug or nod or shake of the head which passes between fellow professionals, the exquisite pleasure of being approved, the unassuaged mortification of being despised within that charmed circle, compared with which public fame and infamy are mere idle breath. What is the good of the papers hiding at Anthem if you know the army knows? What is the good of excuses accepted by government if the men of one's own kind hold one condemned? And this is how the Simla stories really fit in. They are not very good. All Kipling's women have baritone voices, and at first sight they are not a very mature work. But look again. If you don't know about things up above, says Kipling, after recording one of Mrs. Hawksby's more improbable exploits, you won't understand how to fit in, and you will say it is impossible. In other words, at this stage of Kipling's career, Simla society, to which it may be supposed his entree was rather precarious, is itself a secret society, an inner ring, and the stories about it are for those who are in the know. That the secrets in this case should be very shabby ones, and the knowledge offered us very disillusioned knowledge, is the effect of the writer's youth. Young writers, and especially young writers already enchanted by the lure of the inner ring, like to exaggerate the cynicism and sophistication of the great world. It makes them feel less young. One sees how he must have enjoyed writing Simla in a strange place, nor is any man who has not spent at least 10 seasons there qualified to pass judgment. That is the spirit of nearly all Kipling's work, though it was later applied to inner rings more interesting than Simla. There is something delicious about these early flights of esotericism. In India, he says, where everyone knows everyone else. And again, I have lived long enough in India to know that it is best to know nothing. The great merit in Kipling is to have presented the magic of the inner ring in all its manifold workings for the first time. Earlier writers had presented it only in the form of snobbery, and snobbery is a very highly specialized form of it. The call of the inner ring, the men we know, the old firm, the talking of shop, may call a man away from high society into very low society indeed. We desire not to be in a junta simply, but just to be in that junta where we belong. Nor is Kipling in the least mistaken when he attributes to this esoteric spirit such great powers for good. The professional point of honor, it means as much, said McPhee, as her virginity to a lassie. The aidos, which we feel only before our own colleagues, the firm brotherhood of those who have been through it together, are things quite indispensable to the running of the world. This masonry or confederacy daily carries commonplace people to heights of diligence or courage, which they would not be likely to reach by any private moral ideals. Without it, no good thing is operative, widely or for long. But also, and this Kipling never seems to notice, without it, no bad thing is operative either. The nostalgia, which sends the old soldier back to the army, I smelt the smell of the barracks, I heard the bugles go, also sends the recidivist back to his old partner and his old fence. The confidential glance or rebuke from a colleague is indeed the means whereby a weak brother is brought or kept up to the standards of a noble profession, but it is also the means whereby a new and hitherto innocent member is initiated into the corruption of a bad one. We always do it this way, they say, and so, without any scenes or excitement, with a nod and a wink, over a couple of whiskeys and soda, a Rubicon is crossed. The spirit of the inner ring is morally neutral, the obedient servant of valor and public spirit, but equally of cruelty, extortion, oppression, and dishonesty. Kipling seems unaware of this, or indifferent to it. He is the slave of the inner ring. He expresses the passion, but he does not stand outside to criticize it. He plays for his side. About the choice of sides, about the limitations of partisanship after the side has been chosen, he has nothing but very much to say to us. Mr. Eliot has, I think rightly, called him a pagan. Irreverence is the last thing of which one could accuse him. He has a reverent pagan agnosticism about all ultimates. When a man has come to the turnstiles of night, he says in the preface to Life's Handicap, all the creeds in the world seem to him wonderfully alike and colorless. He has the pagan tolerance, too, a tolerance so wide, which is unusual, that it extends even to Christianity, whose phraseology he freely uses for rhetorical effect in his more Swinburnian moments. Some poems could not, on internal evidence alone, be distinguished from Christian work. But the tolerance is weary and skeptical. The whole energy of the man goes into his worship of the little demigods or daemons in the foreground, the trades, the sides, the inner rings. Their credentials he hardly examines. These servants he has made masters. These half-gods exclude the gods. There are, I allow, hints of another Kipling. There are moments of an almost quivering tenderness when he writes for children or for them. He himself had been badly hurt. And there are the queer or the rum stories at the end of the passage, the mark of the beast, or they, or wireless. These may be his best work, but they are not his most characteristic. If you open him at random, chances are that you will find him enslaved to some inner ring. His English countryside, with its way of life, is partly loved because American millionaires can't understand it, aren't in the know. His comic stories are nearly all about hoaxes, and outsider mystified in his favorite joke. His jungle is not free from it. His very railway engines are either recruits or Mulvaneys dressed up in boilers. His polo ponies are public school ponies. Even his saints and angels are in the celestial civil service. It is this ubiquitous presence of the ring, this unwearied knowingness, that renders his work in the long run suffocating and unendurable. And always, ironically, that bleak misgiving, almost that nothingness, in the background. But he was a very great writer. This trade passion, this business of the inner ring, fills an immense area of human life. There, though not in the conventional novel, it frequently proves itself stronger than family affection, national loyalty, religion, and even vice. Hence Kipling's deserved success with thousands of readers who left older fiction to be read by women and boys. He came home to their bosoms by coming home to their business, and showed them life as they had found it to be. This is merit of a high order. It is like the discovery of a new element or a new planet. It is, in its way and as far as it goes, a return to nature. The remedy for what is partial and dangerous in his view of life is to go on from Kipling and to add the necessary correctives, not to deny what he has shown. After Kipling, there is no excuse for the assumption that all the important things in a man's life happen between the end of one day's work and the beginning of the next. There is no good putting on airs about Kipling. The things he mistook for gods may have been only spirits of another sort, but they are real things, and strong.
5. Sir Walter Scott. A toast proposed to the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, 1956. Here in Edinburgh, on 7th June 1826, Walter Scott was kept awake nearly all night by a howling dog. He was in poor health. He was working at the highest pressure, convinced that such efforts might still recover his honor and perhaps even his fortune. His wife was barely 3 weeks dead. But he must not stop to think of that. He chides himself in his journal for the hysterical passion of terrible violence, a sort of throttling sensation which impelled his solitary tears and was followed by a state of dreaming stupidity, 30th May. For all depended on work, and work on health, and health on sleep. In such circumstances, we can imagine what most men would have said about that howling dog, especially most literary men. One thinks of Carlyle. What Scott said will be familiar to many members of the Society. Poor cur, I dare say he had his distresses as I have mine. In those dozen words, the whole sweetness and light of Scott's mind is revealed. I think I want to stress the light even more than the sweetness. We know from other evidence that few men have loved dogs more judiciously. As Lockhart's Mr. Adolphus delightfully says, he was a gentleman even to his dogs. But that is hardly the point here. There is no parade of his love for animals. He flings to the poor cur a word of commiseration, but what is chiefly before his mind is indisputable fact. Dogs don't howl at night if they are happy. There is a sort of clear-eyed recognition that there are in the world all sorts of creatures, and that Scott, with his distresses, is only one of them. It is of a piece with his last recorded words, in answer to Lockhart's question whether he should send for Sophie and Anne. No, don't disturb them. I know they've been up all night. There is in both the same fidelity to common facts. Scott may be ruined, or bereaved, or dying, but dogs will howl, and young women need sleep. For the whole of that journal, indeed, we might borrow a title from an author whom Scott himself fully appreciated, and call it Sense and Sensibility. The sense, I presume, is obvious enough. We see it first and foremost in his cool and moderate estimate of his own literary powers, a modesty almost, one would have thought, impossible in one whose reputation had filled Europe and been blown up until he was put above Goethe and almost equal to Shakespeare. Yet it is not mere self-depreciation. Though never deceived about his weaknesses, he knows his real strength, too, the hurried frankness of composition which pleases soldiers, sailors, and young people of bold and active disposition. He recognizes in his own way the quality of what a more pretentious writer would call inspiration. I shall get warm as I work. The morning, fresh from the labors of subconscious artistry, is musis amica. We see it also in his unchanging, cheerfully unemphatic contempt for the imaginary consequence of literary triflers and the affectations of literature. We see it, this time cooperating with something even more precious than good sense, in his attitude to certain feelings which prey upon most of us at times, as when he notes, 6th April 1826, I had the great pleasure to hear through a letter from Sir Adam that Sophia was in health and Johnny gaining strength. It is a fine exchange from deep and aching uncertainty to the little Spitfire feeling of, well, but they might have taken the trouble to write. End quote. Of all who have little Spitfire feelings, few, I believe, name them so honestly or so happily. But we should do Scott little service with some modern critics by insisting exclusively on his sense, for there is a widespread opinion that genius is never free from neurosis, and unless we can find angst in an author's soul, he will hardly be taken seriously. Well, if we demand angst, Scott can supply that too. He confesses to idle fears and gloomy thoughts, 11th April 1826, to a thick throbbing at my heart, fancies thronging upon me, a disposition to think on things melancholy and horrible, 24th October 1827. He notes repeatedly, and notes as irrational, a horror of reading his papers, so great that the task would leave him with nerves shaking like a frightened child, 10th May 1829. He has known a day when there was a vile sense of want of reality in all that he did and said. He was aware of some connection between these infirmities and the powers which made him an author. These sinkings of the imagination, quote, come to a gifted, as it is called, but an often unhappy class, end quote, who, as he unexpectedly adds, but for the dictates of religion, or the natural recoil of the mind from the idea of dissolution, would often have been disposed to commit suicide, 28th November 1826. All this, however, must be sought in the journal, and there alone. That perhaps is where Scott differs most from the type of artist dear to the modern psychological critic. The blue devils do not haunt his work. They leave no trace of laudanum, drink, divorce, tantrums, perversions, or paranoia across his life. As he says, I generally affect good spirits in the company of my family, whether I am enjoying them or not. 24th September 1827. This is plainly a different thing from that sincerity which is often praised, and which might better be called incontinence. Yet the journal is, I believe, one of the sincerest books in the world, and, which is not exactly the same thing, full of self-knowledge. How severely he exercised this sincerity may be gauged by the entry of 5th March 1826, where, finding something that savors a little of rhodomontade in the entry of the previous evening, he says, I have sworn I will not blot out what I have once written here. I believe few of us would care to keep a diary under such a strict rule against erasure. And to Scott, such a rule would perhaps be more costly than to most men. Scott, who rightly diagnosed pride as his ruling passion, 5th February 1826, and who, when the pen dropped finally from his hand and irresistible tears from his eyes, said, Friends, don't let me expose myself. Get me to bed. Lockhart 10, page 212. The absence of the blue devils from his work, its freedom from all petulance, morbidity, or shrillness, will not now, I am afraid, be regarded as wholly a virtue. Some will feel that with the devils, much else which ought to have come in was excluded. We should certainly not guess from reading the Waverley novels that their author had said in his diary, life could not be endured were it seen in reality, 21st December 1825, or again, I have never yet found that ill will dies in debt, or what is called gratitude distresses herself by frequent payments, 2nd March. Many moderns will think his maxim that a melancholy catastrophe or an unhappy ending should always be avoided in fiction, 28th July 1826, unsound and arbitrary in itself, and veritably disgraceful when we find it in conjunction with such dark estimates of life and man. This will seem to them, for all I have said about the sincerity of the man, to impute a fundamental dishonesty in the work. But I think much can be said in answer to such a charge. In the first place, these tragic or disillusioned passages in the journal are only occasional, and spring very clearly from Scott's momentary situation. We are not called upon to believe, and I myself do not believe, that they represent Scott's settled criticism of life. And if they did, what then? Need we reject as worthless that gusto, that ease and good temper, that fine masculine cheerfulness which is diffused over all the best of his novels and is perhaps their greatest permanent attraction. If this could be shown to be indeed inconsistent with Scott's most permanent conscious thoughts, what should we have to say but that something in his less conscious mind, something that brought his stories to him while he slept, had taken over the pen and forced him to utter the life he experienced rather than the life he saw when he reflected? For, of course, something far more is involved than the mere choice between happy and unhappy endings. Both can be contrived, both with good or bad motives, but the general tone, the thing that makes, as it were, the smell or taste of the whole book, cannot be contrived. In modern times we have been advised, and on the whole I think rightly, always to trust the tone or impression of a man's work rather than his conscious or articulate reflections, where the two disagree. The maxim is, of course, most often applied by those who are finding concealed skepticism or prurience or despair in authors professedly pious, edifying, or optimistic. Perhaps we shall have to use it the other way around for Scott, and say that the tapestry in Jonathan Oldbuck's spare room, the language of Ochiltree, or the whole character of Baillie Nichol Niarvy convey to us a sense of life, which is more important, more fully realized than any mere views to the contrary which Scott may be supposed to have held. Secondly, and this is of more importance to literature, I think any such criticism would involve trying Scott by laws which he never acknowledged. It is now very generally demanded that a novel should be a comment on life. But unless the meaning of this phrase is attenuated almost to nonentity, I do not think that Scott supposed a novel to be anything of the sort. As Lord David Cecil has pointed out, the English novel descends from the English comedy. Not, of course, from English farce, nor necessarily from the comedy of intrigue. We must include under our definition of comedy things like The Merchant of Venice and Twelfth Night. The purpose of the older novel, as of such pieces, was not to comment on life. I do not think that was the primary purpose of the tragedies either, nor of such novels as ended tragically. I do not think tragedy and comedy differed by expressing different views of life. The difference was more that between forms. Both were deliberate patterns or arrangements of possible, but by no means necessarily probable events chosen for their harmonious unity and variety, deliberately modified, contrasted, and balanced in a fashion which real life never permits. Different degrees of verisimilitude occur in different pieces, but I think the verisimilitude is always a means, not an end. Improbability is avoided, when at all, not because the author wants to tell us what life is like, but because he fears lest too gross an improbability should make the audience incredulous and therefore unreceptive of the mood or passion he is trying to evoke. I think this was Scott's attitude. He usually rejected unhappy endings, not because he believed, or wanted his readers to believe, or even for a moment supposed that they would believe, that irretrievable disasters never occurred in real life, but because they were inconsistent with the sort of work he was making, and would not contribute to its oikeia hedone, or hedone. He was not, save very incidentally, saying something about the world, but making an objet d'art of a particular kind. If you like, you may, no doubt, say that he was an entertainer. If you must, I suppose no one can prevent your saying a mere entertainer. That is, his work belongs with the Decameron, the Canterbury Tales, the Furioso, one of his own great favorites, the Marriage of Figaro, Pickwick, and the Moonstone, and not with the Divine Comedy, War and Peace, or The Ring. The distinction I am making is sometimes expressed by using the word serious of the works which fall in my second class, but I think the adjective unhappy because it is ambiguous. In one sense, and this I think is the most useful sense for critics, serious is simply the opposite of comic. In that sense, of course, Tupper and Patience Strong are serious artists, and Aristophanes is not. But serious may mean worthy of serious consideration. In that sense, a gay song by Prior may be more serious than some of the most lugubrious items in our hymn books. What is more, a pure divertissement may be more serious than a long, well-documented, tendentious ethical or sociological novel. Guy Mannering more serious than Mr. Britling Sees It Through. There remains, however, a third sense in which Scott may be accused of insufficient seriousness. This has nothing to do with the genre he was writing. The Furioso is a light work, but Ariosto did not take it lightly. Witness those famous variations in the first line. But Scott often took his work very lightly indeed. There is little sign, even in his best days, of a serious and costly determination to make each novel as good in its own kind as he could make it. And at the end, when he is writing to pay off his debts, his attitude to his own work is by some standards scandalous and cynical. Anything will do, provided it will sell. He says of Castle Dangerous and Count Robert of Paris, "I think the public are mad for passing those 2 volumes, but I will not be the first to cry them down." 26 January 1832. Here we come to an irreducible opposition between Scott's outlook and that of our more influential modern men of letters. These would blame him for disobeying his artistic conscience. Scott would have said he was obeying his conscience. He knew only one kind of conscience. It told him that a man must pay his debts if he possibly could. The idea that some supposed obligation to write good novels could override this plain universal demand of honesty would have seemed to him the most pitiful subterfuge of vanity and idleness, and a prime suspect of that literary sensibility or affected singularity which he most heartily despised. 2 different worlds here clash, and who am I to judge between them? It may be true, as Curtis has said, that the modern world immeasurably overvalues art, or it may be that the modern world is right and that all previous ages have greatly erred in making art as they did subordinate to life, so that artists worked to teach virtue, or to adorn the city, or to solemnize feasts and marriages, to please a patron, or to amuse the people. Or, again, a middle view may be possible, that works of art are in reality serious and ends in themselves, but that all is lost when the artists discover this, as Eros fled when Psyche turned the lamp upon him. But wherever the truth may lie, there are 2 things of which I feel certain. One is that if we do overvalue art, then art itself will be the greatest sufferer. When second things are put first, they are corrupted. The other is that even if we of all generations have first valued art aright, yet there will certainly be loss as well as gain. We shall lose the fine, careless, prodigal artists. For if not all art, yet some art flows best from men who treat their work as a kind of play. I, at any rate, cannot conceive how the exuberance, the elbow-room, the heart-easing quality of Dickens or Chaucer or Cervantes could coexist with that self-probing literary conscience which we find in Pater or Henry James. Lockhart speaks somewhere of Scott enjoying rather than exerting his genius. We may be coming to a period when there will be no room for authors who do that. If so, I admit there may be gains. I am sure there will be losses. This leads me naturally to the question of Scott's style. One is sometimes tempted to say that the various journeymen among us could mend 1,000 passages in the novels. Nothing could easily be worse than the sentence in which Mannering looks up and the planets rolled above him, each in its orbit of liquid light. This perhaps is exceptional. What is unfortunately constant is the polysyllabic, uneconomical, even florid texture of his narrative and descriptive writing. The dialogue, of course, is a wholly different thing. Let but Andrew Fairservice, or the Bailey, or Deuce Davy Deans, or Jonathan Oldbuck, or even Julia Mannering once open their mouths, and at once we have race and piquancy, the living and the concrete. Most interestingly, in the journal, we find Scott using in his own person both the style that repels us and that which conquers us. Thus, he refers to the news of his wife's death as the melancholy intelligence, 15th May 1826. What a choke pear! And what a use of the word melancholy! How calculated to spoil it for contexts where it is really needed. Nor must we plead that Lady Scott was not, after all, the great passion of her husband's life. That, I think, is true, but the phrase is still far too vague and ready-made for the deep affliction which her death was to him. He himself puts that beyond doubt by the words with which next day he expresses its precise nature and degree. I wonder what I shall do with the large portion of thoughts which were hers for 30 years. 16th May 1826. I think the experience of all bereavements, the daily and hourly setting out of the thoughts upon a familiar road, forgetful of the grim frontier post that now blocks it, the repeated frustration which renews not only sorrow but the surprise of sorrow, has seldom been more truthfully conveyed. Here is another example. On 18th December 1825, he is facing the thought that Abbotsford may have to be sold. He writes, "The recollection of the extensive woods I have planted, and the walks I have formed, from which strangers must derive both the pleasure and the profit, will excite feelings likely to sober my gayest moments. My dogs will wait for me in vain." This is, of course, better writing than the melancholy intelligence, but the vocabulary is curiously dead. Then comes a space in the manuscript, and then the unconscious masterstroke. I find my dog's feet on my knees. And this happens again and again in the journal. We find side by side that style which Scott habitually used for narrative and another style far more sensitive, which, if he had more often employed it, would have given him a far higher literary place than he actually holds. In the novels, this better style hardly appears, except in dialogue, and especially in dialect. As a stylist, Wandering Willie can play his creator off the field. He has more music in his sporran than the sheriff in his whole body, and Julia Mannering, at her best, more wit. For his public and inferior style, reasons can be found, one local, the other historical. It was Professor Nicholl Smith who first pointed out to me that a love of the polysyllable had been endemic in Scotland ever since the time of Henderson. He said that in this very city he himself had attended in youth a debating society where students were always rising, quote, to homologate the sentiments of the previous speaker, end quote. But in Scott's time, this local and national infirmity was only the aggravation of a disease which then held the whole island in its grip. We must not allow a few great and highly idiosyncratic writers like Lamb, Hazlitt, and Landor to blind us to the fact that the early 19th century found English in a bloated condition. The abstract is preferred to the concrete. The word farthest from the soil is liked best. We find personage or individual for man, female for woman, monarch for king. Hence, Wordsworth, even in poetry, will have his itinerant vehicle, female vagrant, and casual refreshment. Scott, I am afraid, nearly always called food refreshment, and is among those who have helped spoil that potentially beautiful word forever. Stylistically, then, Scott lived in an unfortunate period, and his real strength was allowed to come out only in dialogue. This, I think, must be conceded. But let us not concede too much. Even his narrative style has the qualities of its defects. The cheerful rattle of his polysyllables, often energetic in rhythm, even where flaccid in syntax and vocabulary, the very sense that not much care is being taken, and the brisk, virile pace all help us to feel that we are off on a journey of pleasure. The jingle of the harness creates the holiday mood, and with tolerable horses and a civil driver, as Scott promises in Waverley 5, we jog along on the whole very contentedly. But whatever may be said against Scott's style and his contrived, often ill-contrived, plots will not touch the essential glory of the Waverley novels. That glory is, in my opinion, twofold. First, these novels almost created that historical sense which we now all take for granted and by which we often condemn Scott himself. Of course he makes historical blunders and even treasures historical illusions. But he, first of men, taught us the feeling for period. Chaucer's Trojans are medieval people. Shakespeare's Romans are Elizabethan people. The characters in Otranto are so patently Walpole's contemporaries that no one could now believe in them. Scott, everywhere, insufficiently no doubt, but he was a pioneer, reminds us that our ancestors were different from ourselves. I have high authority for my statement. It was the master of Trinity, Professor Trevelyan, who first pointed out to me the difference in this respect between the Decline and Fall and Macaulay's history. Gibbon, he said, writes as if every Roman emperor, every Gothic chieftain, and every hermit in the Thebaid was an 18th century man. But Macaulay is always pressing upon us the difference between his own age and the age he depicts. And I attribute this almost wholly, said the master, to the fact that the Waverley novels had come in between. Once it had been said, it seemed to me obvious. And if it is, then to concentrate on Scott's errors in history is like trying to make Columbus unimportant because he failed to produce a full map of America. Scott, like Columbus, is among the great discoverers. If we are now so conscious of period that we feel more difference between decades than our ancestors felt between centuries, we owe this, for good or ill, to Sir Walter Scott. Secondly, the novels embody these immensely valuable qualities of mind which I have claimed for the journal. They may lack many virtues which the novel has achieved since, but they have those virtues of which no age is in more desperate need than our own. They have their own essential rectitude. They slur some things, they exaggerate nothing. Minor frailties are never worked up as enormous sins, nor petty distresses as factitious tragedies. Everything is in proportion. Consider what either Dickens on the one hand or George Moore on the other would have made of Effie Deans. Then turn back to Scott and breathe the air of sense. But I must come to an end. You may feel that I have spent too much time on this great author's faults and too little on his excellences. That is because I am speaking among his friends. Where else does one mention the faults of a man one loves? And Scott today has few friends. Our juniors are ill at ease in his presence. One of these has said that Scott wholly misunderstood his own story in The Heart of Midlothian, for the tale makes it quite clear that the heroine's real motive for refusing to commit perjury must have been unconscious jealousy of her sister's beauty. It is like reading a review by a jackal on a book written by a lion. But we must not grow bitter. Perhaps we shall some day climb out of the present trough, as Scott delighted to quote, "Patience, cousin, and shuffle the cards." And even if no change ever comes, if the barbarism on which we now seem to be entering is to prove the last illness, the deathbed of humanity, we must not rail at those who are its victims. Let us only say, adopting Scott's own words, "Poor curs, I dare say they have their distresses." And indeed they have.
7. Psychoanalysis and Literary Criticism. A paper at Westfield College, 1941. The purpose of this paper is by no means to attack psychoanalysis, but only to contribute to the solution of some frontier problems between psychoanalysis and literary criticism. One of these I consider a pseudo-problem. I'm referring to the use which some critics make of psychoanalysis to infer the pathology of a poet from his work. When this is all that is done, and when it is made quite clear that the result is intended as a contribution not to literary criticism, but to pathology, or pathological biography, I have of course nothing good or bad to say to it. Unfortunately, however, we sometimes meet with a real confusion, in which the proposition, "This poem is an inevitable outcome and an illuminating symptom of the poet's repressions," is somehow treated as an answer to the proposition, "This poem is rubbish." The critic has allowed himself to be diverted from the genuinely critical question, why and how should we read this, to the purely historical question, why did he write it? And that, too, in a sense which makes the word why mean not with what intention, but impelled by what causes. He is asking not for the final cause, which would still have some literary importance, but for the efficient, which has none. With misunderstandings of this kind, we need not concern ourselves. I am going to deal with two Freudian positions, of which one will be found in the 23rd of the Introductory Lectures, 1933. At the end of that lecture, all art is traced to the fantasies, that is, the daydreams or waking wish fulfillments of the artist. The artist wants honor, power, riches, fame, and the love of women, but being unable to get these in the real world, he has to do the best he can by imagining or pretending that he has got them. So far, according to Freud, he does not differ from the rest of us. What makes him an artist is the curious faculty he possesses of, quote, elaborating his daydreams so that they lose that personal note which grates upon strange ears and become enjoyable to others, end quote. As we others also like a good wish fulfillment dream, we are now ready to pay for the privilege of sharing his. Thus, for the artist, as Freud says, there is a path through fantasy back to reality. By publishing his mere dreams of honor, power, riches, fame, and the love of women, he acquires honor, power, riches, fame, and the love of women in reality. You will notice that this is a theory about readers as well as about writers. If Freud had been content to say that all works of art could be causally traced to fantasy in the artist, he would be merely stating an efficient cause, which we might find difficult to disprove. But he makes it clear that we enjoy the product as fantasy, that reading as well as writing is wish fulfillment. Indeed, it is obvious that he believes all imagining or daydreaming to be of a single kind, that in which the dreamer pretends that he is a famous man or a millionaire, or an irresistible lady killer, while in reality he is no such thing. That is what I disbelieve. I want to introduce an addition or emendation, and it is one for which Freud himself has given me the example. In an earlier lecture, the sixth, after telling us that a psychoanalytic explanation can usually be found for the tunes that we whistle when we seem to be thinking about nothing in particular, Freud adds the following, quote, I must, however, make this reservation that I do not maintain this in the case of really musical people, of whom I happen to have had no experience. End quote. This is both honest and penetrating, and leads me to hope that the professor would not have resisted the suggestion that a similar limiting clause would improve his theory of imagination. At any rate, that is what I feel the theory needs. It is true enough if we do not apply it to imaginative people. I am ready to admit that there may be human beings whose daydreams always run in the channels which Freud describes, but surely for most of us, there has been a fairly clear distinction between two kinds of daydreams ever since we can remember. With the sort he acknowledges, the dreams of success, fame, love, and the like, I confess that I am lamentably familiar. I have had dozens of them. But I cannot recall a period when I did not know another kind. The earliest of these, which now comes back to me, is what might be called the snug town. I can see that little town still, with its river and bridges and shipping, the cheeses and barrels piled upon the quays, the high-pitched roofs and the bright green shutters. I am vaguer about the inhabitants, but I think they were anthropomorphized mice. Dressed mice, I would have called them then, with woolen comforters and wide trousers like Dutchmen, with pipes in their mouths. Obviously, most of the images came out of books, and the whole thing is quite commonplace, but the point is that I myself was not a feature in it. I dare say that after the dream had taken full possession of me, I may have wished, and wished intently, that I might find this town in reality and go to it. But that was because I had first imagined the town and judged it to be simply delightful, almost adorable, in its own right. My only reason for wishing to go to it was its adorableness. There was no idea that I was to become a great man there, or marry a mouse princess, or make my fortune out of the local trade in cheeses. And all this time, of course, I was having concurrently the sorts of dreams that Freud allows, dreams in which I said clever things and scored off my governess and fought battles and generally forced the world to acknowledge what a remarkable person I was. You will have divined that this part of my paper is great fun to write. Who could not go on for hours in the same vein? I wish I had time to tell you of all the other constructions, the unknown room in the house, which one was always hoping to discover, the chessmen coming alive, as in Alice, the garden, which was partly in the west and partly in the past. But I reflect that these will hardly interest you as much as they interest me. You would rather write your own. I assume, in fact, that most of you have experienced the same sort of thing, and if you have, you will understand me when I say that the two kinds of imagining are really distinguished by their mere taste. We can, if we are challenged, show differences in the content by pointing out that the self is absent from the one and present as hero in the other, but for our own guidance we need hardly do so. Surely the peculiar tang of the merely personal wish fulfillment is immediately recognizable. Its extreme surface realism, its deliberately prosaic temper, and above all its nagging character, the stealthy insistence with which it occurs again and again like an anxiety. Surely this is utterly different from the unpredictable ecstasy, the apparent otherness and externality of disinterested imagination. It is worthwhile, I think, to emphasize the realism of the mere wish-fulfillment dream, and to draw the literary consequence that a liberal use of the marvelous, the mythical, and the fantastical in a story is, as far as it goes, an argument against the charge of wish fulfillment. The Freudian fantasy exists to give us the nearest substitute it can for real gratification. Naturally, it makes itself as lifelike as possible. It had to be unreal as regards the main issue, for we are not really famous men, millionaires, or Don Juans, and to make up for this, it will be scrupulously real everywhere else. Does not all experience confirm this? A man who is really hungry does not dream of honeydew and elfin-bread, but of steak and kidney puddings. A man really lustful does not dream of Titania or Helen, but of real prosaic flesh and blood. Other things being equal, the story in which the hero meets Titania and is entertained with fairies' food is much less likely to be a fantasy than a nice love story of which the scene is London, the dialogue idiomatic, and the episodes probable. But this is by the way. I do not wish to deny that both sorts of daydream may become the source of literature. I think it probable, for example, that the novels of Charlotte Bronte began as wish-fulfillment dreams, while certain possibly disinterested imaginations about King Julius and the rest, which she shared with her sisters, attempted to express themselves in verse and failed to overcome technical incompetence. Trollope has told us in his autobiography, chapter 3, that his novels grew out of what he calls castle building, and makes the character of his early reveries quite clear by adding, quote, "I myself was, of course, my own hero," end quote. The wish-fulfilling function explains why, as he tells us, quote, "Nothing impossible was ever introduced. I never became a king or a duke. I was never a learned man, nor even a philosopher. But I was a very clever person, and beautiful young women used to be fond of me, and altogether I was a very much better fellow than I have ever succeeded in being since," end quote. It is plainly a textbook case of the self-regarding daydream. But Trollope significantly adds, quote, "In later years, I have discarded the hero of my early dreams and have been able to lay my own identity aside," end quote. This discarding of the hero is Trollope's account of what Freud calls the elaboration that removes the grating personal note, and I do not suppose that I am in disagreement with psychoanalysis if I say that even where a work of art originated in a self-regarding reverie, it becomes art by ceasing to be what it was. It is hard to imagine a more radical change than the disappearance of the self, who was, by hypothesis, the raison d'etre, the reason for existence, of the original dream. The very root from which the dream grew is severed, and the dream is planted in a new soil. It is killed as fantasy before it is raised as art. And two other things are worth noting. Trollope's work, which admittedly springs from wish fulfillment, is work of an unusually solid, realistic, and humdrum kind, which is, in my view, just what one should expect. In the second place, the work is now valued by most readers for just those characters whose fortunes and temperament no one would wish to share, like Bishop Proudie and his wife, or Mr. Crawley and the Archdeacon, whereas the fortunes of the young hero and heroine, where, if anywhere, the last traces of the original self-flattering motive might be expected to survive, are read with indifference. On these grounds, I wish to emend the Freudian theory of literature into something like this. There are two activities of the imagination, one free, and the other enslaved to the wishes of its owner, for whom it has to provide imaginary gratifications. Both may be the starting point for works of art. The former, or free activity, continues in the works it produces, and passes from the status of dream to that of art by a process which may legitimately be called elaboration. Incoherences are tidied up, banalities removed, private values and associations replaced, proportion, relief, and temperance are introduced. But the other, or servile kind, is not elaborated into a work of art. It is the motive power which starts the activity and is withdrawn once the engine is running, or a scaffolding which is knocked away when the building is complete. Finally, the characteristic products of free imagination belong to what may be roughly called the fantastic or mythical or improbable type of literature. Those of fantasy, of the wish-fulfilling imagination, to what may in a very loose sense be called the realistic type. I say characteristic products because the principle doubtless admits of innumerable exceptions. But by this time, I imagine that some of you can hardly contain your laughter at what seems to you the spectacle of a man jumping unconsciously out of the frying pan and into the fire. You have been longing for some time to ask me whether I really suppose that in turning from dreams of power and fame and adult love to dreams of secret rooms and gardens in the past, I have much mended matters. Whether I can really be ignorant that all I have done is exchange dreams that fulfill the comparatively rational and respectable wishes of the ego for those that fulfill the much darker wishes of the id. For of course the psychoanalyst will know what to make of that secret room. The garden of the West is child's play to him, and though I do not know how he will explain my town of the mice, I have no doubt he will make of it something that pertains to infantile sexuality. This brings me to the second of the Freudian doctrines which I have proposed to discuss, the doctrine of symbolism. The doctrine, as stated in the 10th lecture, is this. When we are analyzing a dream, that is, when we are trying to find the latent or unconscious thought of which the dream images are a concealed expression, we find some elements with which nothing in the mind of the dreamer is associated. But it fortunately happens that we can find out what such elements are concealing by drawing, as Freud says, on our own resources. Our own resources apparently means the psychoanalytic examination of folklore and language. The result of drawing on them is the theory that there are certain things in the real world whose images, when they appear in dreams and stories, bear a constant meaning. That is, whether you and I dream of a house or read of one in a tale, the latent thought behind the house image is always the same. These images with constant meanings he calls symbols, the words, so to speak, of a universal image language. He gives us a few specimens. A house signifies the human body. Kings and queens, fathers and mothers. Journeys, death. Small animals, here come my poor mice after all, you'll see, one's brothers and sisters. Fruit, landscapes, gardens, blossoms, the female body, or various parts of it. As I have said, I have no intention of disputing with Freud as regards the matter of fact. This is his special subject, and as a layman I have no means of finding out whether he is right or wrong. For the purposes of the present argument, I am going to assume that he is right as regards fact. But we must be quite clear what it is that I am granting. I am granting three things. One, that infantile sexual experience of the sort described by Freud does occur in all human beings. Two, that latent thought on such subjects does utilize the images I have mentioned. And three, which is going very far indeed, that wherever such images occur in dream, imagination, or literature, the latent thought which Freud mentions is really unconsciously present in the mind of the dreamer, the imaginer, and the writer or reader. I grant all this because if all this were true, it would have no literary bearing. All sorts of unconscious thoughts may be present while we are reading a book. For example, thoughts aroused by the shape of the letters, or by the tactile sensations which the paper affords to our fingers, without making our enjoyment anything other than it seems to be. If latent thought of an erotic character is present in the same irrelevant way whenever I read about a garden, I have as a critic no objection. But we reach something much more formidable when Freud says, quote, "Does it not begin to dawn upon us that the many fairy tales which begin with the words, 'Once upon a time there were a queen and a king,' simply mean, 'Once upon a time there were a mother and father'?" End quote. Simply mean is the crucial expression. They do not mean this inter alia. They simply mean this. This is all that they mean. They mean neither more nor less nor other than this. But how is the word mean to be interpreted? We are certainly not being asked to believe that the teller of the fairy tale intends king to be understood as father, or that the hearer consciously so understands it. I suggest, and let me apologize in advance to all the psychoanalysts if I am wrong, that Freud is implicitly making at least the following claims. 1. That the whole of the excitement, pleasure, or interest occasioned by the image, wherever it occurs, is due to the latent erotic thought. 2. That the image, as opposed to the latent thought, affects nothing at all except disguise, or in other words, that if our inhibitions allowed it to become conscious without shock, the latent thought would give us the same kind and degree of satisfaction as the image now does. It will be seen, of course, that the two claims are really identical, for if the image is anything more than a disguise, if it adds any attractiveness to the latent thought on its own account, then it must follow that the latent thought is not the whole source of the reader's pleasure. If this is not what Freud means, I have nothing to say to him. But I am sure this is what is meant by many of his self-styled followers, and it is certainly this and this alone which brings psychoanalytic symbolism into contact with literary values. It is in this that the sting lies. We do not mind being told that when we enjoy Milton's description of Eden, some latent sexual interest is, as a matter of fact, and along with 1,000 other things, present in our unconscious. Our quarrel is with the man who says, "You know why you're really enjoying this," or "Of course you realize what's behind this," or "It all comes from so-and-so." What we resent, in fact, is not so much the suggestion that we are interested in the female body, as the suggestion that we have no interest in gardens, not what the wiseacre would force upon us, but what he threatens to take away. If it is true that all our enjoyment of the images, without remainder, can be explained in terms of infantile sexuality, then I confess our literary judgments are in ruins. But I do not believe it is true. My first argument against it is based on the reaction that I have just described, the way in which we find our enjoyments disturbed by the psychoanalyst's suggestion. He may reply that such a reaction of resistance is just what he expected to find and confirms our suspicions. But is this really so? If the image of a garden is only the disguise for the female body, and if all the excitement with which I have read Paradise Lost Book 4 is really erotic, then surely when the psychoanalyst has kindly removed the veil and conducted me to the thought which, on his view, I was wanting to think all along, I ought not to feel an anticlimax, but a climax. The affective temperature ought to rise, not fall. A man may go to a dinner under the illusion that he wants conversation when he really wants alcohol. But this does not mean that he suddenly loses interest in the proceedings when the champagne appears. He is more likely to realize, as he raises his glass, that this is what he really wanted, or at least to find the conversation very much better. It is one thing to admit unconscious desires. It is another to admit desires so unconscious that their satisfaction is felt as a disappointment and an irrelevance. What is the sense in attributing even unconscious thirst to a man who feels less at ease after you have given him drink? The psychoanalyst will probably reply that our conscious taste rejects his interpretation because of our inhibitions. He would say that the true parallel is not an ordinary man who wants alcohol without knowing it, but a fanatical teetotaler who wants alcohol without knowing it, and that such a man might with apparent physical horror reject the champagne when it arrived. In other words, it would be maintained that although at some level we really wanted to think of the female body, yet our conscious self is so shocked at the disclosure of our real interest that enjoyment ceases. I am sometimes tempted to wonder whether Freudianism is not a great school of prudery and hypocrisy. The suggestion that we are shocked by such interpretations, or that a disgusted recoil is the cause of our resistance, sounds to me like nonsense. I can speak only, of course, for my own sex and class, and I readily admit that the Viennese ladies who came to consult Freud may have had either chaster or sillier minds than our own. But I can confidently assert that neither I nor anyone I have ever met suffers from such shrinking nausea in the presence of sexual phenomena as the theory seems to demand. I am not speaking of ethics. A man may, of course, have good reason for checking his own thoughts in certain directions, or disapproving many of his own actions. But this is something quite different from horror. Indeed, such a man is likely to look forward with trembling hope to a day when he will become capable of being really shocked, when a light at present inaccessible reveals as essential darkness what still seems to the natural man in him merely ordinary and familiar. To be sure, infantile perversions are in a different category from normal and adult instincts, but I am not sure that even infantile perversions are quite so shocking to us as is claimed. Is not the attitude towards them which Freud assumes something of a public gesture? Does not Freud underrate the extent to which nothing in private is really shocking, so long as it belongs only to ourselves? Suum cuique bene olet. Everyone thinks his own is beautiful. I have watched with equanimity the decline and fall of one of my own fingernails, at which I would have shuddered in someone else. And again, the feeling with which we reject the psychoanalytic theory of poetry is not one of shock. It is not even a vague disquietude or an unspecified reluctance. It is a quite definite feeling of anticlimax, of frustration. It is not as if we had drawn an embroidered curtain and found earwigs behind it. It is as if we had drawn it expecting to find a whole new wing of the house, and had found merely a door that led back into the old familiar dining room. Our feelings would be most unsuitably expressed by the exclamation, "Not that." They demand, rather, the disappointed grunt, "Oh, so that's all." In general, of course, the fact that a supposed discovery is disappointing does not tend to prove that it is false. But in this question I think it does, for desires and fulfillments and disappointments are the things that we are discussing. If we are disappointed at finding only sex when we looked for something more, then surely the something more had a value for us. If we are conscious of loss in exchanging the garden for the female body, then clearly the garden added something more than concealment, something positive, in fact, to our pleasure. Let us grant that the body was in fact concealed behind the garden. Yet since the removal of the garden lowers the value of the experience, it follows that the body gains some of its potency by association with the garden. We have not merely removed a veil, we have removed ornaments. Confronted with what is supposed to be the original, the female body, we still prefer the translation, from which any critic must conclude that the translation had merits of its own. Or perhaps prefer is the wrong word. We really want both. Poetry is not a substitute for sexual satisfaction, nor sexual satisfaction for poetry. But if so, poetical pleasure is not sexual pleasure simply in disguise. It is at worst sexual pleasure plus something else, and we really want the something else for its own sake. I now wish to direct your attention to a part of the evidence which is sometimes overlooked. The Romance of the Rose seems at first an ideal illustration of the Freudian symbolism, for in it we have not only the garden, but the rosebud, which means, in the second half of the poem, exactly what Freud would have it mean. But the trouble is that the whole process here seems to be the wrong way around. The author and his readers start with a fully conscious attention to the erotic material and then deliberately express it in symbols. The symbols do not conceal and are not intended to conceal. They exhibit. The romance may furnish evidence that gardens and rosebuds are excellent symbols for the things Freud has mentioned. But why are any symbols adopted? It becomes clear that humanity has some motive other than concealment for comparing erotic experience to gardens and flowers, that the erotic experience thus compared becomes somehow more interesting, that it is borrowing attractiveness from the flowers, not they from it. And this situation is very common. Donne, in elegies which express, quite frankly, the most ravenous and unidealized appetite, yet finds that he can improve his poem by comparing his mistress to the earth or to a landscape. Burns tells us that his love is like a red, red rose. These phenomena, which might in a confused glance be taken to support the Freudian view, are really its refutation. If in the Romance of the Rose the erotic thought owes much of its poetical charm to the garden, why should the garden in Paradise Lost owe all its poetical charm to the erotic thought? Eroticism on the conscious level seeks not to conceal, but to decorate itself with images taken from gardens. But that which decorates must be in itself, and for its own sake, pleasing. A necklace of pearls is put around a woman's neck because we think pearls are beautiful. If we thought nothing but the woman beautiful, we could not beautify women. We should have no materials with which to do so. As far as this, I think the Freudians are forced to go, and this is enough to save literature. In order to explain the symbols which they themselves insist on, we must admit that humanity is interested in many other things besides sex, and that admission is the thin end of the wedge. Once it is allowed that our enjoyment of Paradise Lost Book 4 is a compound of latent erotic interest and real, though conscious, interest in gardens, then it becomes impossible to say a priori in what proportion the two are mixed. And even if it could be shown that the latent erotic interest was as 90 and the interest in gardens as 10, that 10 would still be the subject of literary criticism. For clearly the 10 is what distinguishes one poem from another, the 90 being a monotonous continuum spread under all our reading alike and affording no ground for the distinctions which we actually draw between banality and freshness, dullness and charm, ugliness and beauty. For we must remember that a story about a golden dragon plucking the apple of immortality in a garden at the world's end, and a dream about one's pen going through the paper while one scribbles a note, are, in Freudian terms, the same story. But they are not the same as literature. That is my defense against the psychoanalytic theory of literature taken in its most uncompromising form. A much more civil and humane interpretation of myth and imagery is, however, advanced by Jung, and one which, in the pages of Miss Bodkin and Dr. Tilliard, has found some interesting critical expression. Indeed, I have slipped into it at times myself. It may be called the doctrine of primordial images, or archetypal patterns. According to Jung, there exists, in addition to the individual unconscious, a collective unconscious, which is common to the whole human race, and even in some degree to the whole of the animal world. Being thus common, it contains the reactions of mind or psyche as such to the most universal situations. Being very primitive, it is pre-logical, and its reactions are expressed not in thought but in images. Myths, or at any rate the older and greater myths, are such images recovered from the collective unconscious. Their power of moving us, which Jung himself obviously experiences in a very high degree, is explained as follows. Quote, if this supra-individual mind exists, everything that is translated into its picture speech would be depersonalized, and if it became conscious, would appear to us subspecie aeternitatis, in the universal perspective. Not as my sorrow, but as the sorrow of the world, not a personal isolating pain, but a pain without bitterness that unites all humanity. That this can help us needs no proof. End quote. Contributions to Analytical Psychology, 1928. You will gather that Jung, when he wrote that sentence, was thinking mainly of collective reactions to painful situations expressed in tragic myths. To complete his arguments, we should therefore add a similar expression about the joyous myths, not as my joy, but as the joy of the world, etc. The most interesting thing about this theory is the strength of the emotional reaction it awakes in nearly all those who hear it. Before its scientific merits have been considered, some are instantly repelled. They have a sense of being lured by sirens or got at by mystagogues. They feel something between fright and contempt, and they resolve to remain at all costs outside the magic circle, to stick to modern self-conscious, self-explanatory aesthetics. Others, with equal suddenness, are enchanted. Every half-conscious expectation that they have formed in the presence of great art seems to be fulfilled, and their hearts are enlisted on the side of the theory before their heads have had time to examine it. Let me confess at once that I belong by temperament to the second group, but have by my training acquired a certain sympathy with the first. Thanks to my training, I can suspend my judgment about the scientific value of Jung's essay on Mind and the Earth, but I perceive at once that even if it turns out to be bad science, it is excellent poetry. This brings us to a most important point, to nothing less, if I were qualified to carry it out, than the psychoanalysis of psychoanalysis itself. Such a hyper-analysis ought to be limited, as Freud limited his analysis of whistling, no doubt. It would not refer to really scientific people, but to the great mass of ordinary people who read psychoanalytic books with avidity and undergo their influence. I do not think we can doubt that for such people, psychoanalysis itself satisfies certain very strong emotional needs. I have just stated Jung's theory in the coldest and least evocative language I could find. Let us now see it as it actually appears in the essay on Mind and the Earth. Quote, we have to deal with the beginnings and foundations of the mind, with things that from an immemorial time have laid buried in the depths. The unexpected question whether the unconscious also has dreams. Are there results of yet deeper and, if possible, more unconscious processes? Altogether too adventurous. This mind of venerable age. A rationalist may laugh, but something deep is stirred in us. Those faraway backgrounds, those most ancient forms, inherited from the dim ages of the past. I have found that an intellectual apprehension of these things in no way detracts from their value. On the contrast, it helps us not only to feel, but to comprehend their immense significance. Not idly did Faust say, the mothers, it sounds so strange. End quote. Do not for one moment suppose that I am laughing at Jung, but quite frankly, my unreflective reaction to all this can only be expressed in some such words as, isn't this grand? Something dim and far removed, buried in the depths from immemorial time, stirring beneath the surface, coming to life, coming up at last? Well, I know where I am now. I am with Schliemann, digging up what he believed to be the very bones of Agamemnon, king of men. I am with Collingwood, discovering behind the Arthurian stories some far-off echo of real happenings in the thick darkness of British history. With Asia, in the fourth act of Prometheus, following her dream down into the cave of Demogorgon. With Wordsworth, sinking deep and ascending into regions to which the heaven of heavens is but a veil. With Alice, finding beneath the curtain the little door which she could not pass, which led to the delectable garden. With my own past self, hoping as a child for that thought-forgotten, that undiscovered room. I am with British Israelites and Baconians and historians of Atlantis, with Renaissance magicians and seekers for the sources of the Nile. In a word, I am enjoying myself immensely. But the point I wish to make is simply this, that Jung's discussion of primordial images itself awakes a primordial image of the first water. The Miss Bodkin's archetypal patterns itself exhibits an archetypal pattern of extreme potency. I trust that you recognize which it is. It might be called the recovery pattern, or the veiled Isis, or the locked door, or the lost and found. The Freudians will explain it in terms of infantile sexual curiosity. Indeed, I have seen Alice and the curtained door so explained, but that need not bother us. Such curiosity may, in the life of each one of us, have been the earliest embodiment of it, for all I know. But since then, we have learned to prefer in it several more exciting and less obvious forms. The thirst which it kindles in us has long outrun those perishing waters. It is indeed an image inevitably embodying certain absolutely universal features of our experience, religious, intellectual, aesthetic, and sexual alike. The presence of such a primordial image in the psychoanalytic process itself is, I think, the explanation of its popularity, for the same image is aroused by Freudian analysis too. In this respect, psychoanalysis heals some of the wounds made by materialism, for the general effect of materialism is to give you where you expected an indefinite depth of reality, a flat wall only a few inches away. Psychoanalysis offers you some kind of depth back again. Lots of things are hidden behind that wall. Hence, those who have once tasted it feel that they are being robbed of something if we try to take it from them. The emotional power of Jung's essay is, as far as it goes, a proof that he is quite right in claiming that certain images, in whatever material they are embodied, have a strange power to excite the human mind. Every sentence he writes helps to prove this. At the same time, we may be cautious about accepting his explanation, since there are some grounds for suspecting that the argument seems plausible, not because of its real cogency, but because of the powerful emotions it arouses. Has Jung, in fact, worked us into a state of mind in which almost anything, provided it was dim, remote, long buried, and mysterious, would seem, for the moment, an adequate explanation of the leap in our blood, which responds to great myth. Let us look at the matter in cold prose. We want to know why certain images are exciting. Jung replies, because they are ancient, because in contemplating them, we are doing what our prehistoric ancestors did. Now, the idea that we are doing so is certainly exciting, as all ideas of antiquity are. But this idea is not necessarily entertained by the man in the moment of responding to a myth. He may not have read Jung's theory. He may think that what he is contemplating is quite new. He may not raise the question of its age at all. Nevertheless, he will respond. If Jung is right, then it is not the idea of following our remote ancestors which produces the response, but the mere fact of doing so, whether we are conscious of this fact or no. But there is no evidence that the actual reproduction of prehistoric behavior, apart from the reflection that we are reproducing it, is at all exciting or impressive. We reproduce very ancient modes of behavior in all our humblest animal operations. We are at one with our pre-Adamite sires when we scratch, and though I have no wish to underrate the pleasures of a good scratch, I think them very unlike those of a good poem. No doubt even scratching may be made poetical if reflect on the antiquity of the practice, but the pleasure we shall get will not be the pleasure of scratching, but the pleasure of historico-poetical meditation. In the same way, I suggest Jung has not explained the pleasure of entertaining primordial images, but exhibited the pleasure of meditating on them, and of entertaining in the process one particular primordial image, which itself needs explanation as much as any of the others. The idea that our sorrow is part of the world's sorrow is, in certain moods, moving enough. The mere fact that lots of other people have had toothache does not make my toothache less painful. I have no answer to the question Jung has raised. I can only say, indulging once more in the same primordial image, that the mystery of primordial images is deeper, their origin more remote, their cave more hid, their fountain less accessible than those suspect who have yet dug deepest and sounded the longest chord or journeyed farthest in the wilderness. For why should I not be allowed to write in this vein as well as everyone else?